again, but I'll walk you through the top level, total non-farm employment, and then the same, understanding goes for each sector below it. So what we've listed for you here, and starting from the left and moving to the right, you can see what employment was in that sector, or in February 2020, before the pandemic began. So statewide, New Mexico had 866.7 thousand jobs. From April, it went down to April 2020, it went down to 762,000, a loss of 104,000. Which was a 12% contraction, 12% change, negative change. And then we're showing, as of August, that number had popped back up slightly to 791,000, which was an addition of 29,000 from the bottom. And so the change in employment from February to August, I'm sorry, okay. Sorry, I'm having trouble reading. So we had lost 75,000 from February to August, but of that, 27.9% have been regained through August. So then you can kind of just, with that understanding, you can go down and look at various sectors. The group has forecast some. For example, mining has highlighted some. Mining is highlighted just to note that there really hasn't been any regain in that sector yet, which is not surprising given what oil and natural gas markets are doing. However, all the jobs in retail trade has 100% regained where it was prior to the pandemic. Other areas that have regained fairly significant and large numbers of jobs are education and health services, and leisure and hospitality. They seem to be bouncing back. And then you've got the outlier of federal government having regained 750%. There again, it's because of the census. Okay, next, basically here we're showing New Mexico non-farm employment all the way back from the Great Recession. You can see that New Mexico had significant job losses from 2008 to 2010, and then did slowly recover, surpassing the level of jobs it had before the Great Recession, probably at about beginning of 2018, I would say on this, and then continued a pretty steady path of growth through 19. And then you see this stark drop off at the onset of the pandemic. What we're showing here then, importantly, in the red or the orange and black lines, the black line towards the top is the baseline scenario for New Mexico for Moody's Analytics, but then they have a more pessimistic scenario in orange. So here we're starting to foreshadow basically that there's great uncertainty throughout the macroeconomy, and that is leading the group to forecast a range. Okay, next I'm going to move on to some slides to update you on the oil and natural gas picture in New Mexico and globally. So as you know, there are several, I kind of explain what happens with revenue as sort of a waterfall effect. You have price declines that waterfall into rig declines waterfall into production declines. And so there's a little bit of timing difference between these events, but here what we're showing is a peak to trough look at rig declines in New Mexico in past cycles and the current one. So what the economists have done is they take the peak number of rigs that New Mexico experienced in one peak to trough cycle and index that to 100. So whatever the number of rigs was, the top is 100, and then show how that declined over time. And so you see that the most extensive and longest decline that New Mexico has, in rigs that New Mexico has experienced in the recent past, is the one that started in December 2014 and fell for 66 weeks before hitting bottom. So, I think the committee, for the most part, the members were there when we were working through that in the 2015 and 16 sessions, and you'll remember that well. In that decline, New Mexico went from a peak of 103 rigs down to 13 over those 66 weeks. In black, you can see that the current rig decline, where we started here in 2020 at a peak of 117 rigs, we so far, over about 30 weeks, have declined to 41 rigs. It's been a faster and steeper decline than the one we experienced in 2015 and 16. And we don't know yet how long it'll take to reach bottom. We aren't there yet. We're still declining. Next, I want to look at oil prices. You can see actuals in blue. These are New Mexico prices for oil from 2018 to present. And then it's interesting to look at the distance between the gray and black lines. The gray is where the group thought we were as of June estimate, and the black shows the improvement over the couple months in the oil forecast. So basically, this is part of the reason that you'll be hearing that revenues are stronger than we thought they were as of the June forecast. Estimates, though, are still showing that the WTI oil prices will close FY21 at just over $40 a barrel. And I can't stress enough just how much volatility there is in this forecast. Another way to look at what's happening in our oil markets, as I mentioned before, when price changes, that's the blue line here, when prices tank, rig counts in red tend to follow. And then oil production, the blue bar, or the gray bars, they tend to follow too on a slightly lagged basis, because we still, the production declines lag by a few months, because the most productive month of a well is usually at second month in production. And you can't just sort of cap them and ask them not to produce. They produce. Put another way, here we have in the blue bars, you can see the percentage change year over year in production of oil in New Mexico. You can see that prior to the pandemic, production amounts in blue were increasing at an exponential rate. 40, 50, 30% higher than year over year. And before the pandemic, we were already seeing that level off, the year over year growth level off, but that was still keeping us at historically high levels of production for New Mexico. For the first month, however, for the first quarter, we actually saw production decline. And now I'm looking at the gray line. That's production. You can see that it peaked in the first quarter of 2020 and came down slightly in the second quarter. To highlight a little bit of data about natural gas, you can see similar but different. Natural gas production by quarter here peaked also in the first quarter of 2020 and came down somewhat in the second quarter. It declined from 478 BCFE to 453. San Juan and Raton have had a steady decline prior to the COVID pandemic, and the amount produced has been steadily declining since 2014. Permian natural gas production is really associated with oil production in the area, and so to some extent follows what's happening with oil production, which I just mentioned is declining. Moving over to the personal income tax. Personal income tax is a definite area of strength in the FY20 fiscal year that just ended compared to the June 2020 forecast. Net personal income tax, I won't go through that quite yet. I think that's the next slide. So there were some administrative actions, though, we want to highlight that could have had big impacts on the timing of revenue receipt, but really didn't. It turned out that the shifting of revenue from FY20 to 21 was very minimal as a result of the tax extension that the federal government and New Mexico allowed. But as you're probably all aware, the tax filing deadline was moved from April 15th to July 15th to give an extra 3 months. And New Mexico followed suit of the feds in that. And then there was also legislative action that was enacted during your special session that waived penalty and interest. It allowed people to file on time but make payment later. And we're finding that not too many folks took advantage of that, but we think that probably means that the relief was well targeted. But you can see basically compared to the June 2020 forecast, those are the dark blue bars. The actuals came in stronger in many ways. The particular strength was in withholding, but also in final and estimated payments. And the thing to remember about the timing of personal income taxes is that the PIT filings that were due this spring, they would have typically been due April 15th, but they were due July 15th. Those reflect people's income and investments and everything during calendar year 2019, before the pandemic and the recession began. A little more detail on withholding. Prior to the pandemic, withholding had slowed. There were 3 quarters of growth, of 8% growth year over year. But then in the fourth quarter of 2020, withholding declined by about 1%. And withholding, think of that as a more current indicator of what's going on with income. Withholding is the amount that the employer takes out of each paycheck for each employee to basically estimate the amount that they will owe in personal income tax at the end. So that's a more current indicator of what's going on with income and employment. The CARES Act payments are probably a source of strength for withholding, and that those Paycheck Protection Program, or PPP loans, kept more people employed and kept withholding strong. Over to employment and wages and salary forecasts. The thing I want to highlight on the left-hand chart, there's been all these new buzzwords in economic news the last several months, like what shaped recovery is this going to be? The newest one that I'm hearing, and they actually brought it up in the debate last night, is a K-shaped recovery. And when you hear that, what that means is that wages recover more quickly than job numbers. And if wages are recovering, but the number of jobs are not, that means that the jobs that are coming back and paying those wages are higher paying jobs. So what we expect to see based on Beaver's forecast does sort of pan that out. You can see wage and salaries are supposed to recover in yellow there more quickly than jobs. And the concern there is that those who are less resilient financially to be able to withstand the economic downturn may be the ones for whom it lasts the longest. It's great that the stock market is returning, but that only benefits folks who have passive income from stocks or a 401k. And if you're in the lower income ranges, that's not as likely to benefit you. So that's what it's about if you're hearing about a K-shaped recovery, and that is what Beaver, to some extent, is looking at for New Mexico. Here on the right, we're just basically showing the forecast from Beaver currently for recovery of jobs in various sectors. The main ones that are not recovering would be down at the bottom, mining. You see it take a steep drop off here at the beginning of the pandemic and stay flat through this period through the middle of through the end of FY23. Whereas healthcare and social assistance recovered pretty significantly. Accommodation and food services is forecast to steadily recover. Let's see, probably something to think about here too is, I was talking about that K-shaped recovery a minute ago. Healthcare and social assistance tend to be some of those higher paying jobs, as with professional and technical services, the dark blue line. And that, again, shows a stronger recovery than most sectors. Okay, over to the gross receipts tax. On the left, you can see what the actual matched taxable gross receipts were for a period of July 2018 through current July 2020. And you can see the marked decline in GRT that started around April 2020. There was some continued growth driven a lot by construction and retail. There were construction projects underway already when the pandemic began that continued through to completion, and some of them are still ongoing. The other thing to note is that federal stimulus also bolstered retail spending, and that also helped withstand what could have been deeper losses in GRT. So if you look at it as far as year over year growth by month, April 2020 was 6.7% lower than April of the previous year. Had a less steep decline of 1.8% in May, about flat in June, and then a 9.8% decline in matched TGR for July 2020 versus July 2019. Probably, I would guess that the decline in July being deeper than the decline in April had a lot to do with the federal stimulus. Here we've shown similar data, but broken up for you by county. And this really highlights those construction projects that were ongoing. So here we're looking at year over year. So the last quarter of FY20 versus the last quarter of 2019. You can, and the lighter the color, the deeper the contraction. So you can see Eddy and Lee have probably the deepest contraction statewide due to what's happening in oil markets and that diminishing rig activity. Roosevelt County had a 292% increase. I can almost guarantee that would have to do with the construction project. So it's a small enough county, and some of these are small enough that one project will really change the year-over-year growth. I wouldn't put too much thought into these numbers in the smallest counties. Here's a similar chart, but we're now, instead of year over year, we're looking quarter over quarter. So this shows the difference from FY20 quarter 3 to FY20 quarter 4. And you can see, again, the lightest colors are the deepest contractions. Again, Eddy and Lee had probably the deepest contractions, as we would expect. Bernalillo, which is a stable base, was down 2.2%. Santa Fe down 3.9%. Doña Ana down 1.7%. Here we're looking at the effect of oil activity on the taxable gross receipts in Eddy and Lee counties, where of course there's a strong relationship between rig activity tends to be taxable under the GRT, whereas production is not. Production falls under the severance tax. And so what you see is that in red you have the rig count, and as that comes down, sure enough, the green line comes down with it. That's the taxable gross receipts in Eddy and Lee counties. There's been a lot of talk about internet sales and how consumer spending is shifting from basically local retail to internet sales like Amazon and Wayfair and you name it, a bunch of others. And all I can say is thank goodness we were able to put the gross receipts tax on internet sales before this started. House Bill 6 became effective July 2019, and it imposes just for now the flat statewide rate of 5.125% on internet sales. As of July 1st, 2021, the local option variable rate will also go into effect. So you can see the blue line shows the contraction during the pandemic in in-state retail taxable gross receipts versus that just massive growth in internet purchases during the pandemic. Okay, to finish up my slides, I have a few here on severance taxes and other energy-related revenues. Severance taxes here in blue are, well, this is kind of hard to explain, but you'll recall that a couple years ago, I think it was in 2017, but maybe 2016, there was legislation that provided for windfall of severance tax revenue above the 5-year average to go to the TSR, the Tax Stabilization Reserve. And as a result of that legislation in 2019, about $183 million was transferred to the reserve. And in FY20, these are unaudited figures, but we expect that about $140 million will transfer. So despite the downturn in the last quarter, severance taxes remained high enough to generate that windfall that will go to the reserve. Monthly production of oil did decline in April and May, but the prices stabilized somewhat and actually rebounded a bit in June. And here's shifting to federal and state rents and royalties on production on public lands. Rents and royalties were expected to decline in 2020, FY20 year over year, just because there was this unprecedentedly large federal land lease in FY19. And so 19 was really the anomaly. 20 came back more in line with the historic trend, although it was still higher than any of the last 5 years. Federal mineral leasing revenues slowed pretty significantly in April through June of 2020 because there was a national, a U.S. federal government decision that halted the land auctions and leasing on public lands from May to July. But those leases did resume in August. They're still low compared to pre-pandemic levels. During the summer, the royalty reductions that we experienced, we were concerned, let me say that, we were concerned that we may experience pretty steep drop-off in royalty revenues because the BLM was offering this royalty relief to producers that had previously entered leases. However, what we've learned since then is that only 3 producers applied for that relief in New Mexico and none of them were granted. So as of right now, it looks like our revenues have not been impacted by that BLM policy decision. And with that, I will turn this over to Secretary Romero, and just let me know, Debbie, when you're ready for me to flip the slide.
Thank you, Secretary Chardon Clark. So we're going to talk about the fiscal year 2020 revenue tracking. Revenues are coming in higher above the June forecast by about $500 million. The bulk of it, as mentioned by Secretary Chardon Clark, is GRT and PIT. GRT and PIT are tracking above the June forecast by about $233 million and $219 million, respectively. The last quarter of the fiscal year performed better than expected, and all of this definitely will have a positive impact on reserves. Next slide, please. So now we get to the Critic Forecast. And so because of the uncertainty that we mentioned, or that Secretary Chardon Clark has mentioned a couple of times, we felt that, well, the Critic is providing a range forecast versus what we typically see. And the range forecast is higher than the forecast in June 2020. So if you look at the dashed dotted line, that is the June forecast. But it's lower than forecasted in December's, which is the dotted line. So the dotted line was the December forecast, and the dashed dotted line is actually the June. So in between that is where we think we're falling. The first chart is a comparison of December, June, and September. The second chart is a comparison of June to September. FY21, the high is $1.4 million compared to a low of $461 million. The last chart is December 2019 to September 2020. FY21, the high being negative $609 million and the low negative $1.5 billion. Again, we're saying that FY20 is performing, or we're seeing that FY20 is performing better than expected. But we anticipate that there's going to be a decline in FY21, and we're starting from a higher base. So if you see that arrow there, right about the point where the 2 red lines start, that's the base that we're starting at. And so we started higher, and so that's why we see the decline is going to be what it is. FY21 will face a brunt of the revenue declines. So we think the lowest point in employment, we think it's because of the employment, where we're expecting employment, the COVID-19 uncertainties, and we expect lower oil volumes. So there's still a lot of uncertainties that we're dealing with. Next slide, please. So this is the general fund reserve. I mentioned that we expect that 2020 estimate, well, we know the reserves are going to be higher. The FY20 revenue tracking is tracking above the June 2020 estimate. So the suggested total general fund reserves will grow from 28.9 to about 29.4 by the end of the fiscal year. That was pretty unexpected. We didn't expect that to happen at all. The total general fund reserves are estimated to be at $2.1 billion of recurring appropriations at the end of FY20. So, which helps us definitely helps us. It's a better picture for us going into the FY21 legislative session. But again, there's not enough for us to be able to pinpoint a specific numbers, so that's why we are definitely providing ranges, or the CREG has provided ranges. FY21 September high reserves are estimated at 38.5%. FY21 September low reserves are estimated at 26%. These percentages don't account for any legislative actions that will be taken in FY20 or any non-recurring appropriations that will be discussed or potentially could be discussed in FY or for the 2021 session. Next slide, please. So again, we have improved revenue outlook from the June forecast, but it's still we're still more pessimistic than compared to December forecast. You know, December was really high, June was really low, and now we're falling in between that point. When compared to December 2019 forecast, the September 2020 forecasted range is lower by $610 million or 1.5 million in FY21, 377 million to 1.2 million in FY22, 345 million to 1.251 million in FY23. The September forecasted revenue range is higher than the June forecast by 460 million to 1.356 million in FY21 and by 572 million or 1.418 million in FY22. The September range estimates can be a plus or minus 430 million or plus or minus 6% of new money in FY22. The correct September forecast range is higher than the forecast in June 2020, but lower than the forecast from December 2019. I keep saying that. There's still a lot of great uncertainty. We don't know what's going to happen with COVID. We don't know if we're going to get additional federal funding. We don't even know if the feds will consider allowing revenue to be used to backfill, of the funds to be used to backfill revenue. We don't know what the overall oil demand is going to be or the overall economic recovery. Although I did see and have heard some chatter yesterday where there is another proposal being discussed. It's still not clear what is included in that proposal, but at least they're starting to talk again. So one of the things that I have said that the election, I think what's had a big impact to all states across the nation is the fact that we have this election going on at the time when we're dealing with COVID and the revenue shortfalls. And, I think we would have hoped to have seen more action by the feds, but the fact that there's an election pending, I think we haven't seen what we would have hoped for. So some bullet points on the Critic Forecast, why they chose to go with a range. There's continued, again, the uncertainty level, the high volatility between June, December, and September forecasts. And it represents Craig's surest assessment of revenue at this time. So we know what we have. We're pretty sure of what we have for FY20's closing the fiscal year. But what's really uncertain is the economy, COVID, any federal stimulus actions, oil and natural gas recovery. We don't know what the temporary job losses are going to be. We don't know if they're going to be permanent. We don't know how many businesses are going to survive this, even though there's been lots of activity to try to help small businesses. We are hearing, and I think everyone is hearing, that there's concerns about a second wave of COVID. What's really important and what really hasn't been, there's lots of discussion about a vaccine and, when it's going to be released. We don't know what is going to be available. We don't know who are going to be considered high risk, who's going to get the shots, how it would be distributed. Still all things that have not been determined. So that, next slide, please. So some more bullets on why, on the Critic Forecast. Again, the uncertainty. We don't know what consumer and business behavior is going to be because we don't know what's going to be coming as far as federal stimulus is concerned, or what the pandemic is going to create. Again, I mentioned the vaccine, when it's going to be available. Employment recovery is still a big issue. I think Secretary Sharon Clark mentioned that we're seeing that higher wage jobs are moving in the right direction, but we're not so sure about some of the lower wage jobs and what the impacts are going to be to those individuals. I think that it's unknown when and if we're going to have the agreement. I mentioned that a few minutes ago, and there's just knowing when we're going to have more stimulus or how it's going to affect the economy. Moody's is saying that the later that we get some kind of stimulus agreement, the less effective it is going to be. So that's really key to note. And again, we're talking about the oil demand and uncertainties for oil. We don't just, it's Secretary Sharon Clark talked about the waterfall effect. I think this is a perfect example of that waterfall effect and how it impacts, especially a state like New Mexico. So the last table that we provided is an economic indicators table. That's just an appendix that we typically provide whenever we do this revenue tracking and reporting report. So that's all I have for right now. Thank you. So there was good news, bad news.
On.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. I'm Dawn Iglesias, your chief economist for the LFC. I'm joined today by Ismael Torres, our other economist at LFC, and it is a pleasure to be here with you in person today. I am going to share my screen here for those of you on our web call. And we'll start on page 2 of the LFC handout. I'll do my best to be brief. I know we're running behind on time, and I'll try not to overlap some of the things that the secretaries have already presented. So as they discussed, there is significant uncertainty in the current outlook, and the consensus group decided to provide a ranged estimate for this forecast. So the revenue outlook always has uncertainty and risk, but there are some things about this particular forecast that make it unique. For one, the revenue data that came in since the last forecast was stronger than expected, but it was in a manner that was seemingly inconsistent with the state's economic conditions, particularly given the high unemployment rate. So in general, when you have high unemployment, you tend to have lower total incomes, less spending, and therefore high unemployment tends to translate into a drop in GRT collections and in personal income tax collections. But that is not what we saw happen. Instead, April to June revenues appear to have been significantly propped up by federal fiscal policy. And FY21 and FY22 outlook will be heavily influenced by future federal spending, but it's currently unclear whether another stimulus deal will be reached, what such a package might include, and how it will affect consumer behavior. So a key component to this forecast is currently missing, and each of our macroeconomic forecasts from Moody's and from IHS differ every single month in the assumptions that they make on this federal spending and the outcome that it's expected to have on the economy. So that is all, part of what is contributing to our uncertainty. Again, the secretaries did a good job of leading to all of the different things on the path of the virus, the recovery in employment and oil and gas markets that are all contributing to this outlook, which is very unclear and is constantly changing. So this revenue forecast, more so than other forecast periods, face a high risk of being significantly revised in December. And that is why we're now looking at a range. So we're looking at a range for FY21 between $6.4 billion and $7.3 $1.3 billion. And that is a huge amount of variance, such that a point forecast today could end up being wholly different from a point forecast in a few months, which is why we're providing a range for you today. The Secretary's already covered the U.S. Macroeconomic Outlook. One thing that I will add to this is that the federal fiscal and monetary response to this crisis was completely unprecedented. There was $3.9 trillion of federal income supports that were provided in the second quarter of 2020. The Federal Reserve provided near zero interest rates and massive injections of liquidity into credit markets. And so that's been a big driver of the stock market that has seemed almost completely disconnected from current economic conditions. And the truth is, no one really knows how the economy is going to emerge from this crisis. I point you to the chart on the side of this page from IHS Markit, which is every forecast they've provided for real GDP each month since May, with leading into this forecast. And you can see that every single month, the outlook is substantively different, which is part of why we are facing difficulties coming to you today with a point forecast. As the Secretaries mentioned, we lost over 100,000 jobs in April. We recovered only about a third of those jobs lost. And another significant part of the story is that many New Mexicans have left the labor force. So if you look at the unemployment rate changes from July to August, July's unemployment rate was 12.7% and seemingly decreased to 11.3% in August. But if you look at actual employment was not significantly different from July to August. What was different was the number of people who were in the labor force. So now in August, not only is states' employment down nearly 70,000 year over year, but there are also 60,000 fewer people who are actively looking for work in August. The Secretary's already covered this page and where our employment remained down in August in all major sectors except retail, with the most jobs lost in leisure and hospitality. Moving on to slide 6. What we saw was that even though businesses were closed, many faced restrictions on their activity, and a significant number of New Mexicans were unemployed. Tax collections in the fourth quarter of 2020 did not fall off a cliff in the way that we had feared. So heading into the June session, we were looking at an economic picture at the time, prior to having any actual revenue data for that quarter, that seemed like there was a good chance the state would need to dip into reserves to cover FY20 appropriations. Now, actual data for that quarter suggests that that won't be necessary, and the Secretary's covered that we're looking at FY20 ending reserves of about 29%. Moving on to the next slide, we see now that the missing piece of the puzzle that we didn't have at the time heading into our June forecast was how effective federal stimulus might be in propping up the economy, and turns out it was pretty effective. First of all, you had the Paycheck Protection Loan Program, which injected $2.2 billion into the New Mexico economy. It provided 22,000 loans to keep, as an incentive to keep workers on the payroll. Those loans were forgivable, and about 1/4 of the entire New Mexican workforce was supported at least in some way by businesses who were receiving these loans. There was also another over $500 million in funding into the New Mexico economy through the Economic Injury and Disaster Loan Program. And then, of course, the federal income supports, which are a really big part of this story in terms of personal income tax collections and in terms of gross receipts tax collections more significantly. So unemployment benefits for self-employed and independent contractors, so those who usually don't qualify for state unemployment insurance, had income supports that they normally wouldn't have in a recession. There was the one-time $1,200 stimulus checks that were distributed, and then you had the extra $600 a week unemployment benefit. And you'll see in this chart on the right, many New Mexicans through this unemployment benefit were receiving more income than they had received when they were employed. So generally, when you have high unemployment, you have lower income, but because of this extra unemployment benefit, that was not the case in this recession. So Bieber actually estimates that total personal income, including all transfer payments, actually increased about $9 billion for New Mexico in the quarter from April to June, whereas their May forecast looked at projected personal income that was relatively flat. So that's a big difference in why we saw the Q2 revenues like we did. And then, of course, there were other state-funded loan programs that also help support businesses in that quarter. The Secretary has already covered this in some detail, but where we saw the additional federal income supports showed up pretty heavily in retail spending. So despite high unemployment and businesses operating at limited capacity, retail spending actually increased during the pandemic. So the growth in online sales completely offset any declines in in-person retail spending, and overall retail trade was up 11% for the quarter. Now this appears to have slowed some in July, but retail was still up about 8.5% in July. Now this effect is expected to fade as the economic stimulus starts to expire. And then, of course, as we know, the leisure and hospitality industries experienced the largest declines, and also in-state other services. This tends to capture repair and maintenance services and personal care services, which are still down, both of these industries still down pretty significantly in July. So when we're looking at April, total match taxable gross receipts only declined by about 6% overall, so far less than our expectations, and for the quarter only declined 2.4%. So if you look at the detail on this chart, particularly looking at construction and retail trade, you can see that receipts from construction and retail, which together account for about 35% of all MTGR, entirely offset the losses in mining and in leisure and hospitality for the fourth quarter of 2020. Now, as the Secretaries mentioned, moving forward, we do expect GRT to continue to decline in FY21. This will be driven by the losses in oil and gas drilling related receipts. So a big part of our GRT growth over the last few years was due to increased drilling activity. So declines in this industry will have an outsized effect on GRT, and you can see that showing up in the July data, where the mining receipts were down 56% in July, and that's contributing to an overall decline in July of 9.8%. I'll skip the detail on the counties. The Secretaries covered this very well. And in the interest of time, I'm also going to skip the slides that I have on rig counts and oil and gas production. One thing that I will mention is our ranged forecast for production for FY21. So we do expect FY21 total production to be lower than FY20, somewhere probably between a decline of 13 and 30%. So we produced 368 million barrels in FY20. In FY21, we're looking at a range of somewhere between 260 and 320 million barrels. This will depend on how much new drilling and well completions can offset the natural decline rate of existing wells. So you can see here the Permian drilling activity on the right-hand side of this chart. Drilling activity was down 75% in July. Now, well completions saw an uptick in August, and as it appears that some of the drilled but uncompleted wells were completed in August as well, but it's still down. Well completions are still down over 70% from last year. So this decline in drilling activity will contribute to the expected decline in FY21 production. So skipping ahead to slide 16, many have had the question on whether our current outlook is U or L-shaped, or the Secretary was mentioning a potential K-shape. So what we are looking at now is following an initial bounce back that we're starting to see. It does appear that the state will have a more muted recovery going forward. So when we were heading into the June forecast, we were looking at total employment projections of losses of about 150,000 jobs in the fourth quarter. Bieber was projecting total wages and salaries would drop 6% in FY21. But now actual BLS data is showing employment losses averaged about 90,000, and Bieber's now projecting total wages and salaries to decline by 1.1%. So the sort of effect of this is illustrated in the middle chart, this matched taxable gross receipts chart, which provides a forecast provided from LFC on matched taxable gross receipts going forward. And what you can see is the yellow dotted line was our expectations heading into June on how much match taxable gross receipts would decline, but then have a stronger rate of recovery moving forward. What we're looking at for this forecast moving into September is we can see actual MTGR didn't decline as much as we had expected, and it's not expected to go as deep. The decline is not expected to be as deep, but the recovery is much more muted. And that story is sort of lost for the picture for FY21 and FY22, where the difference between the yellow line and the red line is how we would come up on the revenue forecast in the near term. But you'll see that the actual longer term projection is not significantly better. And we're still looking at employment, if you'll see on the right-hand chart, at employment still taking 4 to 5 years to recover. So a drop that wasn't initially as steep and a bounce back that is not as steep as projected either, and still taking a significant amount of time for the state to recover its lost jobs. The slide on 17 just re-illustrates something that the secretaries have already shown you. We're looking at FY21 revenues declining somewhere between 7 and 19% from FY20, and that's going to depend on the extent of the recovery. And we're looking at FY22 recurring revenues ranging somewhere between 6.8 billion and 7.6 billion. And again, that's a huge amount of variance. So the legislature did take action in June, reducing recurring appropriations that did better position the state to deal with this projected range of outcomes. Your current recurring budget right now is 7.2 billion, so in between, as the secretaries mentioned, sort of in between where our revenue range is now. One of the other things is the use of above trend revenues that you can see in FY19 and FY20 for one-time expenditures. That action would help, or did help, reduce the total potential impact of the current downturn on recurring budgets. So I'll simply conclude here with wrapping up similarly to the secretaries on slide 18 with the revenue outlook range coming up from June, but still well below the pre-pandemic forecast. You know, the economic recovery is showing signs of slowing down, and there is the possibility that businesses may not be able to sustain those reduced capacity operations, especially after Paycheck Protection Program loans are starting to, the terms of those loans are coming due. So between now and the end of the year, we don't know how many people who are, or how many businesses that were receiving those loans would have, would be unable to sustain their current payroll employment levels once the terms of that loan is made. So the loan would be forgivable as long as they kept persons on the payroll for a certain amount of time. But once the terms of that loan expires between now and the end of the year, we don't know if we'll see additional layoffs after that. We also know that BLS employment surveys tend to undercount unemployment loss, or tend to undercount employment losses, so it's potential of a revision to that data showing higher unemployment than what we're seeing now, and we do think that it will still take years to recover. Additionally, we don't know what will happen with consumer spending or where the federal stimulus and income supports will go, and that's a big unknown for moving forward. So even though the near-term outlook does seem somewhat better than June, there are plenty of reasons to be cautious and in our planning moving forward. And with that, Mr. Chair, I am happy to stand for questions.
I think we're going to go to, before we turn to questions, because they're going to be overlapping areas, if we can turn to the economic activities supported by oil and gas industry in New Mexico by Richard Anklam and Tom Clifford. Richard or Tom, are you on? Richard and Tom, are you on? We'll probably have our next meeting in Red River. We had excellent reception in Red River on the internet.
Mr. Chairman, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you. Go ahead.
I apologize. I thought we were later on the agenda. If you can, Tom, are you on?
Yes.
You're on. Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I'm having trouble with my... Tom, can you enable screen sharing and I'll begin? Can you try to screen share it for me?
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, sorry for the interruption. Thank you for the opportunity to talk. My name is Richard Ankle, New Mexico Tax Research Institute. With me is Dr. Tom Clifford, and we're here to talk about a report that we just did, taking a deeper dive into the value of the oil and gas industry relative to the New Mexico economy. As you're aware, we do that revenue report regularly, but we have access to the input software, which provides input-output estimates. It helps understand how it affects households and other businesses. It also provides estimates of how it affects the state and local spending supported by industry payments. Data from state and local were used to validate the results as we have that other data. And it's reasonable. The model itself is a generally accepted one. There are others, and they'll all yield, slightly different results. But the key findings in 2018, it appeared that the oil and gas industry spending supported about 134,608 jobs, or 12.1% of the state total. 7.6 billion of labor income. You can see on the slides it's up 13.5% of the state total. 16.6 billion of gross state product, 15.8% of the state total, and 2.2 billion of state and local taxes, about 25% of the state total. Nothing surprising there, really, as we understand what a key role the industry plays in the state. And as we saw in earlier presentations, we know that actually can go both ways. And with that, I'll turn it over to Tom.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Richard. Can everybody hear me? Or
We can hear you.
I can.
okay. So yeah, I guess before we leave the findings, I guess the thing that's interesting here is that the state and local tax share at 25% is significantly higher than the share of the economy, which you might say is let's say the gross state product share. And as we'll see, that's really due to the severance taxes. That's the main difference there that sort of increases the contribution of the industry. I don't think I'll spend too much time on definitions and things like that. This is a kind of a typical input-output analysis of the economy, but with one important distinction that we're making here, or one additional component, and that is the impact on employment and the state's economy of the government spending, the state and local government spending that is funded by the industry. The definitions are a little different than what you usually look at. For example, on employment, you usually look at the Workforce Solution Department reports that are based on payroll employment. This report includes self-employed individuals and sole proprietors. So it's a slightly broader net than the report you're used to looking at. State and local taxes, when we talk about these amounts, when you see these amounts and the share and so on, does not include the royalties and permanent fund distributions that you typically look at when you look at the industry's share of the general fund, for example. So we'll talk about that in a moment. And again, input-output analysis is, it's frequently used to model impacts on the economy. What happens if I change, create a new form of investment in the economy? It's because they have to integrate state and national data, it is not as granular as the kinds of reports that you get from your own workforce solutions, your tax department, and so on. And so there will be some mismatches between some of these results and the ones that you typically see. But it does enable us to look at the interactions within the economy, and that's the useful exercise here. So the main results here, and it's a kind of a complicated table, so I'll just go with, let's talk about employment and then maybe state and local taxes. So the direct are the direct jobs funded in the industry itself and also within state and local government by the taxes it pays. The indirect are the jobs that are supported by industries that serve the oil and gas industry. And the induced are then the jobs that are supported by the spending of households, those employed in these industries, and the owners, they're spending in the state's economy. And so you can see, compared to direct employment of about 76,000 jobs, total employment estimated of 135,000, roughly double that figure, not quite double, in terms of those total multiplier effects of the industry. And there's the New Mexico total is a little over 1 million when you use this broader category of employment, and therefore the oil and gas share at 12%. And again, we modeled this through two channels. One is the payments to businesses and households. That's the traditional input-output analysis. But the second is through the payments to the state and local government. Oddly enough, the traditional input-output analysis doesn't model the feedback of those state and local tax payments back into the economy. Those models are typically structured around how do the industries interact, and they don't focus as much on the government feedbacks into the economy. So we had to add that in. And this breaks that out for you. So you can see for the traditional input-output analysis, the top part of the table, of roughly 42,000 direct jobs in the industry, and they support through their contractors and through the payments of their households, roughly another 45,000 jobs. So a total of almost 88,000 jobs through that industry to household, industry to industry payments, and industry to households. The payments to state and local government support another 35,000 direct jobs, not as many jobs in the indirect and induced category, but a total of 47,000. So that's how the 135,000 breaks down. Roughly 2/3 of that due to the traditional input-output analysis, and another third attributable to the payments from state and local government. I won't go into the details. These are the inputs by the type of industry category. Very useful, though, when we analyze gross receipts tax, things like that. We can look at some of these sub-industries and identify. What is another thing different about this report is it does include all of the stages of the industry. So you can see we have retail in there. We have natural gas distribution. So this is the entire industry. Typically, when we talk about the revenues, we're focusing on the upstream component of the industry, like the extraction, the drilling, and so on. This is a broader look. So this includes all of the various stages of production for the industry. Those are the employment impacts at the typical group of industries that you look at, kind of aggregated industries. And of course, most of the industry contribution is in the mining sector, with a significant contribution in the utility sector, and so on. The state and local government spending that we incorporated in the report that drives that component of the results is based on our other report that we do each year, where we estimate the general fund and other fund contribution, local government contribution. So this input includes the royalty payments, and it includes the permanent fund distributions, and that's why at $3.3 billion, it's larger than the $2.2 billion of state and local taxes generated by the industry. So this is the basis of the state and local government jobs and their multiplier impacts that you'll see in the report. So this was based on calendar year 2018, we wanted just to bring you up to date, just as you've been doing with the secretaries and the economists, in terms of what's happened since then. And this is based on the June forecast, the May forecast by the consensus group. So FY21 probably will come up here somewhat, but the problem is, as you can tell, we've come down since calendar year 18. And so the impacts that we're looking at here in this report would be probably lower, probably significantly lower, if we were to update them to, say, FY21. Richard, do you want to take over?
Sure. Just in closing, input output, someone's mic is on, I believe, is a widely used method that provides a simplified but insightful picture, right, of the state's economy. But it's not granular and it's not perfect. It just gives us more information to consider. It allows us to trace effects of spending by businesses and governments. You know, we say in our slide that, you know, they punch above their weight, the oil and gas industry, and that's just because of the array of contributions that they make through rates and royalties and other payments. But we want to emphasize that this is in no way a substitute for the consensus revenue estimating group's economic analysis, because that's the granular need. But we think this provides, you know, some insight and some useful information, and Mr. Chairman will stand for questions.
Does that conclude your presentation?
Yes, Mr. Chair, thank you.
We're going to turn to questions now. Vice Chair Lundstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all the presenters this morning. A couple of comments, and then I do have a question. First, I'd like to start by congratulating the Consensus Revenue Group for using a range. I think that's the correct approach when we're using December 2019 as the high and June 2020 as the low. In our June special, of course, we thought we'd be close to $1 billion in shortfall. And so what I'm seeing now is that this is basically a wash. At the end of the day, when we look at what these range numbers are and what we think we see in terms of growth. Of course, that doesn't include anything like supplementals or deficiencies or anything like that. So none of that would have been factored into this report. I think it's also important, Mr. Chairman, that we recognize and thank the governor and her staff for the direction to the agencies at looking at that 5% reduction. I think that's going to be very helpful for us. But my question is, Mr. Chairman, to the presenters, is this whole idea of a muted recovery. When we talk about recovery, are we saying that we're still going to need to factor in a continued federal stimulus? Are we looking at the fact that we can't have an uptick in the virus? Was there a breakout in terms of business activity for each one of those quarters? I'm concerned about that level of recovery. And then lastly, under job growth, we see that it's based on higher wage earners, but does that mean we're going to need to have additional general fund in supportive services such as Medicaid for those non-higher wage earners? So when we're looking at muted recovery, there's a whole bunch of factors built into that. And my concern is that we saw growth based on a foundation that's a little shaky. I mean, we're on federal payments going out to people, that kind of thing, that may not happen again. Or if it does, at a complete different level. We see job growth only in one sector, but what about everybody else? So if you could, I'm real interested, Mr. Chairman, on this concept of a muted recovery. And again, I'd just like to congratulate the staff for looking at this as a range, because what it tells me is it's a wash. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr.
Anybody
Chairman.
want to respond?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman and Representative Lundstrom. I can respond in part, and then I'm sure other panelists will have pieces of this too. I want to note that the Bieber forecast, for which a lot of the New Mexico forecast is based, does not assume there will be additional federal stimulus. So if there were additional federal stimulus, you could see that as an upside risk to the Bieber forecast. It's as far as the risks to the forecast that made sense, where our federal policymakers were responsive to the events unfolding around them in a timely manner, you would think that the risks would sort of self-mitigate themselves. So the worse that the COVID crisis was, the more federal stimulus there would be. And so those two would offset one another and make the revenue less volatile. But that is a big assumption, that federal stimulus will be responsive and timely in a manner that's warranted given what's happening in the economy and with COVID.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Madam Chair. I am happy to also try and respond to your question. So as the Secretary mentioned, the IHS forecast for July, which contributed to the Bieber forecast for July, and if you look at page 16 of your LFC slides on the employment forecast comparisons. So this employment forecast, the IHS and Bieber supposedly did not include any additional federal fiscal stimulus in their forecast because at the time it was unknown. The impact of that, though, what we're uncertain of is whether or not those models are fully capturing the economic impact of what no federal stimulus would actually mean for the New Mexico economy. And that is part of the reason why we have the range for you. So we can take the Bieber data, and we did, and we can pull those into our models and say, this is what the models say revenue should be, but we are expecting some variance around that because we don't actually know how that federal stimulus or lack thereof might actually play out into New Mexico's economy. I'll take one example of the unemployment benefits. So if we had an extra $600 a week in unemployment benefits like we did for the second quarter, and we know that propped up retail spending, we know that propped up some other services, if there is an agreement on a $300 benefit, is the effect proportional? Would we see half the spending to equate half the benefit or not? We don't know. And that is part of the reason for that variance and why we're giving you that range today, because even without the expectation of federal fiscal stimulus currently baked into the baseline, we're not entirely certain how that's going to play out for our revenues. And with a few more months of data, we'll be able to see August, which had the expiration of the unemployment benefit. Now, we did have a few weeks, about 5 weeks or so, of the additional federal supplement that New Mexico provided for $300 a week. But that would not show up in August data because that was going to be sent out as a lump sum payment in September. So we might start to see some of that effect, but that's part of the reason we're giving you a range today. And then in terms of what the stimulus might do, again, if you look at this Bieber outlook, there's a reason we show you July and August. So August employment outlook, which is the lighter blue line, Bieber ran a quick and dirty update for us because the August IHS macro forecast included an extra $600 a week expectation for continued federal unemployment benefits, which we know didn't happen. It also included additional one-time stimulus checks in September, which didn't happen. But when Bieber reran that expectation of more stimulus spending in their forecast, the unemployment outlook is actually lower than the July outlook with no spending, which is sort of contrary to what some might expect. And so this is contributing to why we feel very uncertain at this point to be able to give a point forecast. And you're absolutely right. Things that can happen with a potential resurgence of the virus, we don't exactly know what that might look like. Now, the expectation is that shutdowns are probably unlikely unless there was to be a huge resurgence, but in terms of expanding limited operations, that could happen. And whether or not those federal income supports are there will matter. So you make a very good point, Madam Chair, and that is contributing to our uncertainty now.
Representative Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I had just a couple of questions to whomever I am addressing it. One was on the GRT calculations by category, where we look at mining. It struck me that when we look at the overperformance of Roosevelt County on GRT, that's driven by the Sagamore Wind Project, where Xcel Energy is investing $900 million for 240 turbines, and it's got to be done by the end of the year. So I said to myself, where is renewable energy part of mining as a category, or where in the GRT categories does renewable energy projects fall?
Mr. Chair, Representative Anderson, a lot of that is going to fall under construction. If we look, I don't have that detail for this presentation, but I could provide it to you certainly. But if you look at construction in Roosevelt and in Torrance counties, the construction receipts are very large. It's also showing up in utilities. So their utilities receipts are very large. It is not showing up in mining. It does not appear.
Thank you for that answer, Mr. Chairman. My observation is that by my measurement, renewable energy is a form of energy and is being miscategorized into construction. Why not then do we put the drilling capital investments and gross receipts into construction as well?
Mr. Chair, Representative Anderson, they actually do. So construction receipts in Eddy and Lee County have been very large in the last 2 years, and that's for companies who participate in construction-related activities. They may be companies that primarily identify as construction companies, but they're working primarily in Eddy and Lee County on mining-related activity. Now, they're classified as construction, and we see construction receipts being very large in Eddy and Lee County prior to this pandemic. You'll also notice in Eddy and Lee County, construction receipts declined significantly in July.
Thank you for that. Then, if we move from gross receipts over to employment, do we then also count those, do we count those as mining jobs, or do we count those as construction jobs for the purposes of employment?
Mr. Chair, Representative Anderson, it's going to span both industries depending on how they classify themselves. So you'll see it show up in construction, you'll see it show up in mining as well.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I think one of these displays shows 12% of the New Mexico workforce in energy-related employment. Then I see that that expands to that 12% of our workforce produces, I've moved the page, but a higher percentage of gross domestic product. I forget what it was labeled, and then ramps up to 25% of state and local taxes. However, we don't count all the taxes, including severance tax. My question would be, without that labor force, without the mining labor force, would there be any severance tax income?
Mr. Chair, Representative Anderson, if I'm understanding your question correctly, if there was no mining activity in New Mexico, then there would be no severance tax from that mining activity. Presumably that you're talking about mining activity from oil and gas. Now, we do get severance taxes from things like coal and some other mining activities that would still exist. But if you're referring specifically to oil and gas, then no.
Thank you. And what percentage roughly of severance tax receipts would oil and gas be?
Mr. Chair, Representative Anderson, over 90%.
Over 90%. Thank you. Well, I guess my point simply was a relatively small labor force produces a rather large source of revenue for the state of New Mexico, which is no great surprise. But I think I saw a slide that said it's 3.3 billion, and I thought, well, 3.3 billion of 7.1 billion budget is 45%. I know we see many staggered and different calculations, but we never seem to see the higher one. We always read about in the paper the lower ones. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Munoz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Secretary Romero, I want to ask you a question on the presentation, and maybe Dawn can weigh in on the Secretary's presentation on page 34. She has that point in time with the arrow, and I forget what she referenced it as, but why did you pick that point in time where those, you got the two red lines and then the dotted line? Why did you pick that point in time to adjust that number to there? Or the in this Craig forecast range?
So, Mr. Chair, that is the point in time. I'm looking through my notes. That's the point in time where the Craig. Hold on.
And Mr. Chairman, Dawn may want to chime in a little bit.
Mr. Chair, Senator Munoz, so the point that she's referencing in this chart is FY20. So currently, FY20, we have most of the revenue data for FY20. So we know about what FY20 came in at. And that is why both of the ranges sort of start from that point of FY20 where we have actual data.
And so, thank you, Don. And Mr. Chairman, so Don, when you look back at that point, did you go back and look to 16 and back to 2010 for any references that matched up in this from the past history to current history?
Mr. Chair, Senator Munoz, if you're asking about the revenue history for total revenues going back to those years, yes, we don't have them referenced in these charts, but yes, we do look at revenue history going that far back.
And Mr. Chairman and Don, so maybe at some point you could just show me that reference and see where we were in 10 and 11 and in 16 and where our revenues were hit the hardest, and give us a comparison. I am looking at some other economic trackers for New Mexico, and have you seen this? So the job postings in New Mexico, which we need for an economic recovery to create jobs and put people back to work, is down 40% in New Mexico, and that's through pretty much yesterday, September 30th. Neighboring state Texas next to us is 39%. Or 30%. Arizona's 11%. So how much do you weigh, they're talking about a mute recovery, but if the jobs aren't there and the job postings aren't there, then the recovery gets even harder. So how do you tie that 39% jobless posting to your unemployment and to your recovery?
Mr. Chair, Senator Munoz, I think one of the better things to illustrate sort of how that could be incorporated into what our outlook is, or how it is incorporated into our outlook, is if you look at, again, the comparison page on LFC's page 16 for total employment forecast. So you can see that Bieber is expecting that roughly half of the jobs that were lost in the second quarter of 2020 would be regained by about the end of the year. And then thereafter, you'll notice there's not a lot of growth. So what we're seeing is that some of the jobs that were lost, certainly not all, only a third right now, of the jobs that are lost have come back, so people have gotten their old jobs back, but you're absolutely right, there aren't a lot of new job postings. And so that expectation is that the recovery from now to the end of the year, in terms of just that initial bounce back, the jobs will get back, will mostly be people who lost their jobs. But Bieber's only expecting half of the jobs that were lost to come back, and then any growth thereafter is very limited.
So, Mr. Chairman and Don, maybe the Secretary wants Secretary wants to answer this too, is, so if we're only expecting 50% job growth back, is that what I heard correctly, is roughly 50% of the jobs will come back? So we're going to have 50% losses. So how long is this economic recovery going to take us? I mean, it's not going to be mute. It's going to be worse than what we think is what mute is if the jobs aren't there.
Mr. Chair, Senator Munoz, so both Bieber and Moody's expect it to take till about 2025 for us to reach pre-pandemic employment levels. And their pessimistic scenarios assume that it would take longer than that.
And then I just want to touch on one other point, Mr. Chairman. I think the good representative from Roswell over there kind of mentioned it, and so there is pretty much no more mining in New Mexico. I think there's one coal mine in McKinley County still working. The copper mines have shut down. There's this point going across America that no fracking, and either way you look at it, on either side of the aisle, the oil companies win whether they frack or don't frack. If they already have the wells, the oil will go to $100 a barrel and we'll pay the price at the pump. But what does that really mean in our budget? If that is, and the good representative's numbers are right, it's 90%, roughly 90 or 45% of our entire budget. And then Richard Anklem and them in their activity said it's almost $9 billion in total to New Mexico, or I'm sorry, labor and income's $55 billion in New Mexico for oil and gas direct impacts. So how do we prepare for those cuts? Because if you ask me, if the jobs don't come back and the political environment continues the way it's at, then there's no jobs in New Mexico. So we're going to see that 50% outflux. So how do we make those adjustments? And did you look that far in the future to kind of calculate some of that stuff?
Mr. Chair, Senator Munoz, you make a good point about the impact of oil and gas on our overall budget. And you'll notice that if we look at the detail for FY21, the declines in mining-related or oil and gas-related activity are the primary reason why we're seeing declines in revenues in FY21. We are seeing other things show up for GRT. We've gone through some of that. Leisure and hospitality is down. Other services are down. But in terms of their total effect on matched taxable gross receipts, it's smaller than the effect that we know that mining has. And so the whole reason, I wouldn't say the whole reason, the major reason we're expecting continued declines in GRT in FY21 is drilling-related activity, because that's the reason we saw so much growth over the last few years. So we have provided the ranges in terms of what this effect might be, because we don't know entirely how the industry is going to respond moving forward. We know that the Dallas Federal Energy Survey said you need $52 a barrel on average to drill a new well in the Permian Basin. And currently, New Mexico's oil prices for September were $38. Now, there are some operators who can drill new wells, and there are still 40 rigs out there, but that's definitely less than the 117 rigs that we had in March. So we will see production declines, we will see GRT-related declines, and employment-related, we will see that some of those jobs won't come back that were lost. 30% of mining jobs have been lost year over year for August, and they appear to still be declining. So that does have an impact. It is in the forecast and part of our forecasted range, and part of the variance in our current range is what the actual impact to the oil industry is going to be. How much does production actually decline? How much does GRT actually decline? And how much are personal income taxes affected by these high-paying jobs not coming back?
And then to go back into that point a little bit, Mr. Chairman, is, so how many drilled and unproduced wells are sitting out there waiting to open? And what's that count of production? Because when the oil price hits whatever it needs to hit for them to be profitability, whether it's 58 or 42 or whatever their number is, then those wells will come online. I'm assuming that they will start producing once they can make income off them. So how many do we have sitting out there, and do we have any rough calculated volumes of what that could be?
Mr. Chair, Senator Munoz, I'll turn you to page 14 of your LFC handout. It's going to be the chart on the right-hand side. This is total Permian Basin. Granted, we don't have the data right now specifically for New Mexico, but there are over 3,500 drilled but uncompleted wells sitting in the Permian right now, and you'll notice that that DUC count did go down from July to August, and well completions ticked up from July to August, but new drilling activity, the blue line, went down from July to August. So as you're saying, what appears is that producers are completing some wells that are sitting out there drilled but uncompleted rather than producing all of them. And this is, again, one of our unknowns for total production for the state and for total activity, is how many of those drilled but uncompleted wells they'll bring online. Because you're absolutely right, when it's attractive on a price basis to drill new wells, they may simply complete some of the wells that are out there in order to maintain higher levels of production. We do think that this will sort of limit the decline that we're looking at for Permian production activity. So in New Mexico, we're looking at declines ranging between 13 and 30%. So we don't think that it will be much more than 30% because they do have all of these outstanding DUCs. Prices did stabilize around $40, and we do have producers who can drill and are drilling at that level, though at much less than it was before. But our high range is 13%, and so part of that high range could very well be do well completions for those DUCs produce more or contribute more to production than what we might otherwise expect.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for your presentation all. Don, I have a couple of questions. I guess my first question is, this is being presented to us as a range, high end, low end. But as I hear the conversation progress, that unemployment or employment is not going to come back as quickly, or we're not sure we're going to get any more federal, I find myself inclined to drift toward the more conservative number than the higher number. Should we anticipate a tighter range at our next meeting or our December meeting, or are we going to come to a point where we're going to have, what do we do as legislators? Do we just pick the midpoint and that's kind of where we process our thinking? Or I'm not sure I understand what you're doing with the range. As I hear the conversation, I'm driving toward the lower number. Can you speak to that a little bit, please?
Mr. Chair, Representative Crowder, I'm happy to speak to this, and of course, if the secretaries would like to add to that, I'm sure they would want to. In terms of the December forecast, so the next time that we'll come to you with a presentation, we will come to you with a point forecast. You have to be able to use that for planning in the legislative session. We do need to have a point forecast for you, and we will for December. Part of our impetus for providing a range this September is that if we were to provide you a point estimate today, there's a high likelihood that when we come back to you in December, it could be significantly different, and therefore making the number that we give to you today less helpful. So we're trying to give you a range of where we think December could be, and we wish that we could make it tighter, but there are so many unknowns right now that we're really looking at this wide variance. Now for December, you will have a point number, and that point number will have a lot of uncertainty in it too. A lot of these questions will not be answered by December, but we still have to provide you a point forecast, and we will. That is one of the things I will say that reserves do help with, so that we will be wrong. We'll either be high or be low. We're going to do our best to give you where we think revenues will come in based on the information we have available at the time, but it's your reserve levels that help you deal with that variance in case we come in too high and revenues were to come in too low, as you're expressing concern for. And I'll turn it over to the secretary, so I'm sure would also like to comment.
So, Mr. Chair, thank you for the question, and I think that that's the reason that we don't know what to expect. And so we're making the best guesses that we can on where we should be as far as developing all the budgets. We're going to be as cautious and calculated as we can in developing them. The fact that we have instructed all agencies to come in with a 5% reduction, that's off of the special session budget that was approved. We're coming in much lower now than we were even in FY19. I think we're coming in lower than FY19 budget request, and so it's going to be a really hard time for us, because we can't wait to see what the feds are going to do. We can't wait to see what COVID is going to do. We need to make sure that we continue to move forward and provide the services that we need to provide. And we just need to make the best guesses that we can. And so that's why that range provides us some leeway. I personally think that we need to just continue to proceed with caution. We just can't say we're going to go with the higher number. We need to have that flexibility. So, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Chair, I just want to support the sentiments of both Ms. Iglesias and Secretary Romero. I think going into this, it turns out to be our saving grace that both the legislative and executive branches together had the restraint to build the reserves to historic high levels and not grow recurring spending as much as could have been done. And those reserves are what give us the maneuverability to make sure that, regardless of what happens next with revenue within that range or near that range, the reserves give us the flexibility to make sure that we can continue to provide critical services to New Mexicans who need them most, and also ensure that the state's fiscal house is in order.
Representative Crowder, you still have the floor.
Thank you, I appreciate that very much. I appreciate having the ranges today. I think that is wise and respect that very much. But I just found myself, as the conversations progressed, I found myself drifting toward the lower one, because it seemed most of the conversations were saying employment's not coming back, we don't know if we're going to get more stimulus, et cetera, et cetera. And that's what prompted the question. My second question is, you spoke a little bit about the GRT was propped up by the federal stimulus funding, and I agree with that. I think it did quite a bit. And I find myself always going back and looking at different benchmarks, and Don, I know you're very much aware of the one I'm about to mention. And that is the phase out of the hold harmless and the amount of money that the state retains and does not send back to the cities and counties. We were anticipating in the 20-year it would be around $40 million that the state would have a net gain from holding back the hold harmless. So in part of your processing of all of these numbers, where you're seeing things that are driving the GRT up, was the hold harmless holdback part of what drove up the GRT numbers through that process?
Mr. Chair, Representative Crowder, we do include the hold harmless phase out in our GRT forecasts. So we did see increases in hold harmless payments in FY20, partially because of a significant taxpayer amendment, partially because of hoarding behavior. But moving forward, we are expecting hold harmless payments to gradually decline over time, and that's because of the phase out.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to see a bump first and then a decline, because we're going to go from the 6% to the 7% from the 20 to the 21. And so there will be a little bit of a bump up on what the state holds. But I'm just always curious about those numbers as we go forward, and what role they played in your CRIG group process of watching GRT increase. I'm anticipating every year that we'll have, I think we were anticipating about a $13 million increase this year over last year. And so I wondered what role that played. And my only other question is a comment. I didn't hear anything about some of what our chair lady talked about as far as expenditures and the consideration of that moving forward, or as far as the muted recovery. The majority of my phone calls have to do with the education system and broadband and Wi-Fi and the things that are going on within our school systems, and the impact and cost to the state to adjust our school systems to whatever the new normal is going to be. And I don't know if when you went through the CREG process, did you dig in and kind of apply any information as to, from the Martinez-Yazzie lawsuit and how that's going to impact us going forward, and as we look at our budgets moving forward, has that been part of the consideration?
Mr. Chair, Representative Anderson, expenditures are not part of the revenue forecast, other than tax expenditures that might reduce revenues. So it is part of the overall budget outlook that LFC looks at, and I'm sure part of the overall budget outlook that DFA and the executive is looking at. But it's not part of the revenue estimate per se.
All right, thank you for that, and that's a great answer. But I guess I'm still sitting back here looking at the whole broad picture and wondering what components are in this and what expenditures are going to pull away from the revenue that we're anticipating. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for your responses.
Representative Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This question is probably for Secretary Romero. The question I have is, I know that the unemployment benefits have been completely depleted, and we have borrowed $35 million from the Federal Reserve, I think. How are we going to repay that money, number one? And how are we going to have money to put the money back into the unemployment system?
So, Mr. Chair, that's a good question, and I think that Secretary McCamley has a plan. I don't know all the details yet. He's given me little bits. They think that we're going to have the revenues should be increasing for unemployment so that we can start paying some of that. There's a possibility that depending on if we meet certain criteria that we may not have to repay it. I don't know all the details. I'm happy to get some more information for you from Secretary McCamley and get back with you on the actual details and what our expectations are for unemployment benefits and loans that we're getting.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Mr. Chairman, on that money that's been borrowed from the federal government, I think it's at $35 million or so. That's interest free for right now, isn't it?
Mr. Chair, that's my understanding.
Madam Secretary, Mr. Chair, do you have any idea how long that interest free is going to stay there? Because at one point, they're going to start charging interest, and we need to find out how we're going to pay that money back or make plans down the road. Because we need to have a plan instead of just saying, well, let's see what happens at the end of the day. Because if we start charging interest and we don't have the money, what are we going to do? Do you have a plan for that?
So, Mr. Chairman, let me do some checking. Let me reach out right now to see if I can't get an answer for you on when when we may have to start paying interest on that. So if you'll give me a few minutes, I'm happy to get back with you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, but back to what I just finished asking you, it's going to happen, and it seems to me like there is no plan in place to address this issue when it does happen, and then we're going to be scrambling to see what we did wrong from here to there, and we need to have a plan in place.
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative, I can tell you that it will be discussed, that we'll be putting together a plan as we develop the budgets. That's going to be part of the conversation, I'm sure. There's no doubt about that. And so I may not know the details of the plan right now, but I will definitely find out, and I will get back with you on that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Madam Secretary. Because when we get into the next session, and these issues are going to come up on money owed and stuff, and it'd be kind of hard to do a budget where we don't have a plan to see what we're going to have to be paying. Thank you for that. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Gonzalez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I have two questions, and one of them is in reference to the rig count, and it was mentioned that we were at 117 and we're now at 41, and that means minus 76. So does our state, do we have a way of tracking to what happened to the 76 rigs?
Mr. Chair, Senator Gonzalez, a lot of them are sort of parked, if you will. There is satellite data for drilling companies or for mining support companies that looks at what the rigs look like sitting in sort of their warehousing, for a lack of a better term. And that appears to be, a lot of them are parked, so they're not being used either in the Permian Basin or in New Mexico. They've simply sort of come out of commission.
So, Mr. Chairman and Don, in a way, that's not good for them, that they're parked, but on the other hand, if we were to have an increase or a rebound, that means that they would be available to come back and be at our state. And that's a lot better than if they're at another state, to try and bring them back. So, that's good to hear that part. So thank you for that. The other part is, so are we seeing any part or any forecast on the ski industry for this coming winter?
Mr. Chair, Senator Gonzalez, excuse me. That's an excellent question. I don't have a specific forecast for the ski industry, but I'm happy to look into that for you and follow up with you after. We do have forecasts from Bieber on sort of regional employment, though I don't think they pull out Taos in particular. It's usually our metro areas, but that is a good point. We do have GRT data for Taos, which shows that it has been down, and there's potential that if people do not come back to the skiing activity in a way that they used to before, that would be a drag on the ski valley. Yes, and also a dry winter, Mr. Chair, Senator Gonzalez. There's the potential that we might not have as much snow as we've had in the past.
So, Mr. Chairman, with this, as far as for the industry, the sooner that the governor's office, comes up with, whatever she's going to allow or not allow, that is going to be the key, because, their bookings, they begin since now. And the discussion that I have had with them, they're all like right in the center of like a ball. They don't know if they're going to go left or right. And so, I hope that we can make that a positive one, because again, that's also brings a lot of jobs. Some of them are temporary jobs, but it's jobs. So anyway, well, thank you. And maybe as we go on for our next meeting, we might have some information on that. Thank you again. Thanks to all the presenters.
From a time management standpoint, we still have 3 more people on the list, and we're running a little bit overtime right now. Senator Sanchez.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you, panelists, for the presentation. Listening to these forecasts prior to coming into the legislature and then being here for 8 years, this presentation today seems to me like the most uncertain numbers presentation to it that I've ever seen. We are in unprecedented times, and we just don't know what's going to happen. I mean, not only in New Mexico, but nationally, politically, economically, health-wise. I mean, everything is so uncertain out there, and I know you all do the best you can, and it's a difficult time that the upcoming legislature is going to need to use to do some budgeting here. But it's a bit scary. I don't know what numbers I would use if I was going to be here in this seat helping with formulating a budget come the regular session or the session. So anyway, that said, it's just a bit scary now with everything that's going on in all sectors of our economy, in all sectors of our healthcare, in all sectors of our education system. That's one area we're really losing, is in our education system right now. And that's hard to predict what's going to happen. I can just see what's happening with my own family members trying to learn online, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But anyway, that's kind of the cards we are dealt here at this time. Secretary Sheridan Clark, you had mentioned something that maybe I misunderstood on the withholding. Did you say that withholding is up? I was looking for the slides. I have so many places open up on my computer here. Is withholding up? And of the withholding that's up or stable or whatever, how much of that, what percentage of that is of the revenue withholding? I don't know if you have that data, is from the private sector, and how much is from the public sector?
Thank you, Mr. Chair and Senator Sanchez. Yes, I'm looking for the slide, and I haven't found it yet, but there is a slide in our deck where basically we're talking about FY20 performance compared to the June 2020 estimate, and that strength in withholding was one of the reasons that FY20 came in significantly higher than estimated. And we do think that the federal stimulus between the PPP, the Paycheck Protection Program, and then other other loans and things like that. I think slide 20 in the presentation that the two secretaries went over is the one you may be looking for. But not all of the strength was in withholding. There was also strength in the final estimated payments that were filed to settle between April 15th and July 15th. And so the net was up. And then refunds were also a little less than anticipated. So there was strength across PIT in FY20, but the main source was withholding.
Okay, thank you, Secretary. Thank you, Chairman. Do you know what breakdown on withholding, what the withholding comes to the state, what percentages from the private sector, and what percentages from the public sector? Because I don't believe the public sector, whether it be schools or the state or federal government, very much layoffs or furloughs. Am I correct in that? So the withholding would mainly come from the public sector?
Mr. Chair, excuse me.
No, I was about to say I want to defer to Don on the granular details, but I would agree with you that the job losses have been more severe in certain sectors of the private sector than job losses in the public sector. But I think Don has more detail than that.
Mr. Chair, Senator Sanchez, you're absolutely right, and I echo the Secretary's statement that we did see some stability in withholding because of government employment. I don't have the granular TRD withholding data, but I can tell you that of total wages and salaries in New Mexico, about 30% of total wages and salaries in New Mexico are paid by government employment. So that's a pretty significant chunk. That's almost a third of the workforce that's being supported by, or at least a third of wages and salaries. And wages and salaries is usually what we use to determine our forecasts for withholding, because you are going to withhold on wages. So I would wager to guess that somewhere around 30% is that in line with the percentage of government employment.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. On gross receipts, you know, where they were up more than what they were going to be down, but because there's, I guess, more spending going on. Do you all, as a consensus group, ever work with the banking industry? Because it's something strange has been happening in the banking industry where our deposits have climbed. And I would have thought that people were staying home, not spending money, but gross receipts is going up. So I'm trying to figure that out. Why are our deposits climbing and spending is going on? Maybe it's just a timing issue.
Mr. Chair, Senator Sanchez, you bring up a really good point, and it's part of, again, our uncertainty in this forecast, is we are seeing two competing pieces of information. We're seeing spending go up. We see our gross receipts tax collections go up, but our national data also is indicating that savings are going up. Personal savings have increased significantly during the pandemic, and we see different types of pieces of data. For example, JP Morgan Chase did an analysis of the the quarter from April to June for the pandemic, and they found that of employed households, so households that kept their jobs, tended to spend 10% less, and therefore they're probably saving that money. They also still received the one-time stimulus checks, and not everybody chose to spend those. Some chose to deposit and save it. Then of unemployed households, JP Morgan Chase found that spending went up 10% for households that were unemployed, probably relative to the additional income that some of those households may have received due to the extra unemployment benefits as well as the one-time stimulus checks. So we're sort of seeing two competing effects. Both of them appear to be true. We are seeing more spending, but we are also seeing more saving, and it just varies along different types of households.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And the other thing is that I think there is some correlation between this. It's amazing how much of our discretionary income goes to casinos, to gambling. And with them shut down, I think that's part of the reason also for the increase in savings, increases in our deposits and stuff, because I think a lot of that, the millions and millions, go to gambling. And that's discretionary income that I think wasn't being spent. And my last question here is, it kind of goes to what Senator Gonzalez had asked about the rigs and that. Does anyone, maybe Senator Kearney might know, or someone who's familiar with Senator Novell, how long does it take for a rig to come back online if it's set dormant? You know, say if prices go up, and neither one of them are in the chamber right now, but if prices go up, how long does it take a rig to come back online to produce?
Mr. Chair, Senator Sanchez,
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, if I could real quick, like every answer we hear every day, it varies, but typically these rigs are stacked close to the fields that they work in. Maintenance procedures are often carried on by the non-drilling hands who perform the maintenance, which readies the rigs to go back to work when work reappears in the patch. There's usually a lag time from the time you contract a well to be drilled of several weeks, and that depends on all other lights being green from a regulatory all the regulatory permits are in place, and when that rig mobilizes, that's a very expensive move, so they're not inclined to move them until they're ready to move back out of the yard where they're being serviced and prepared for further service in the field. And they may be in those yards for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you, panel, for your presentation. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Woods.
Mr. Chairman, just a quick recap in my mind. It was stated that 1/4 of the workforce was supported by the stimulus dollars, and we had 106,000 people that lost their jobs. Did all that 106,000 get the 600 per week, or do we know whether that was a fact, Mr. Chair?
Mr. Chair, Senator Woods, so any of those who lost their jobs who claimed unemployment insurance, so they would have had to have claimed either traditional state unemployment insurance or the federal pandemic unemployment assistance, but then yes, they would have received the additional $600 a week if they were claiming unemployment.
We're just multiplying those two figures together, the $600 times the 106,000 jobs, that's $63 million a week that could have been punched into our economy. Is that somewhere close to what happened?
Mr. Chair, Senator Woods, I think you're hitting part of what we're talking about here is that personal income significantly increased. So yes, if you did sort of that back of the napkin math and took the number of people on unemployment and multiplied that by the $600 a week, then you would arrive at a relative figure that would say that would additional money was in the New Mexico economy that would not have otherwise been there.
Okay, and the last question, do you pay personal income tax on unemployment insurance?
Mr. Chair, Senator Woods, yes, that personal income tax is not withheld from the check, but it is paid. So come tax day, when tax liability is assessed, the unemployment income will be part of income and will therefore contribute to that liability. One thing I will point out is that for many New Mexicans, they don't have any income tax liability. Either they don't make enough already. So it's entirely possible that come tax day, persons who were, some of those who were claiming the unemployment insurance won't have to pay necessarily on that unemployment insurance tax. It would simply reduce the refund that they would otherwise get.
And Mr. Chairman, just quickly, what wage level, what income level is it that we do not charge personal income tax on?
Mr. Chair, Senator Woods, I wouldn't say there's not an income tax level at which we don't charge income taxes. If our marginal tax rate does apply at all wage levels, however, we have a variety of credits and deductions that ultimately reduce our taxpayers' liability so that by the time all the calculations are done, they end up with no actual tax liability, even though they are technically charged income tax. I don't know if the Secretary would like to contribute to that answer.
Sure, Mr. Chairman, you're right, Don. There isn't a level in the rate structure that doesn't pay tax, but because of things like LICTR and other low-income tax incentives, I think it would be safe to say that at least $24,000 to $27,000 of income is probably not taxable in general. Through our tax structure, but that's not an exact amount. And then there are things like the working families tax credit that apply, and they vary depending on number of dependents, and they phase out gradually as income rises. It's not an exact number, but somewhere in the high 20s would be a good ballpark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Additional questions? Certainly appreciate the task that we've put the estimators to in this day and age. It always brings to mind a statement that was always given to me by somebody a lot smarter than I am, that God doesn't like a carrot, but he doesn't appreciate a fool either. And we're sort of stuck between not knowing which direction to go from that. We hear the rhetoric, and I think Moody's stated that we won't get back to employment levels of pre-COVID days until 2025. That is obviously an extremely scary thought. We hear the rhetoric about gross receipts going up, and we attribute a certain amount of that to the federal spending. But there's a flip side to that also. There was hoarding taking place on items that were taxed. And trying to clarify which is very difficult. And when people are apprehensive about what the future holds, they're going to go out and probably hoard in areas that are even taxed. And so that's going to drive some of that from that standpoint. The other issue that I've always been concerned about, and you don't hear a lot of talk about, is the underground economy when it comes to gross receipts tax. In an effort to get additional jobs right now, you've got small contractors out there saying, you pay me in cash, and this is what the price is going to be. Well, when people are the beneficiaries of that service, they're also apprehensive about what's going on, and they're more apt to say, hey, I'll pay you in cash. I think that number is extremely large in the state of New Mexico. You lump that with what we've already exempted from taxes, and pretty soon you're talking about real dollars. The issue that sort of floats around in my mind. We were talking about the unemployment insurance and what the rates are going to be. I want to remind the committee members that in about 2010, something like that, 2012, we went through this. And the small business people were asking for relief. And what we did, we artificially held that rate down legislatively and complied with that. And then when we had to rebuild the fund and the economy seemed to turn around, we had to go up on the rates for that. And all of a sudden, the small business community said, look what the SOBs in Santa Fe did to me, when in fact they were asking for that. We went through that this last session, where in a sense we're trying to hold that rate down. Now, the only way we're going to be able to rebuild that fund is if we have a windfall from oil and gas and might be able to repopulate that fund, or we ask the federal government to forgive that from that standpoint on a national basis. Now, everybody that is appalled at the handouts that we have in this country are going to be lined up wanting a handout in that direction. I don't know what our federal government's going to do, and I'm not here to place blame on any one group. But I mean, you talk about the ebb and flow of reality of what's happening right now, we've got a mess. When we talk about returning to pre-COVID days on what it's going to be, I'm not certain we're going to return. I had conversation with a mine that I totally respected in the oil and gas industry. For those that are waiting for it to return, they believe that it's never going to return to where it was. We're on a trend where there's a reduction in fossil fuel utilization and a movement in the direction of green renewable energies on that. They even went as far to say that any oil and gas that we have, oil, in all likelihood there will be a future where we will be importing that, because the United States is on a course now to do away with fossil fuels. It might be expedited under one administration versus the other, but the long-term trend is that we're moving away from that. Those oil and gas people are looking for alternative investments, some in this state, because they're too consolidated, too concentrated in certain parts of the state. But when you translate that to the impact on the state revenues, it reflects how difficult a job that our forecasters have trying to give us something so we can move forward with. It's been certainly fascinating, certainly been enjoyable in one sense to listen to all the participation that we have. We're going to get a bunch of new elected people in the legislature, and that's quite frankly good for the state of New Mexico to come in with some different ideas. But right now, they're out there making promises on what spending levels they're going to have, and they weren't participating in this meeting right now, listening to the forecast on that. So the challenge is going to be there when those promises are not going to be delivered fully into the future on that, to go back to their new constituents and find out that they're going to be somewhat disappointed. I know of no better time right now, and the discussion's really not taken place. And I've talked about revenue reliability. What's going to happen if we expeditiously move in a direction of greatly diminishing oil and gas revenues quickly? It's going to cause a convulsion, a seizure in the state of New Mexico. This would be a great time, and we should have started several months ago, of how do we stabilize revenues in the state of New Mexico, and how do you phase in different rates. I sort of see a period where we're not going to be able to phase in those rates, that we're going to have to do it all at once. I encourage legislative leadership in the future and governors in the future, and I mean starting in January, to start thinking about that issue, because our revenues from oil and gas are not going to be there. The only reliable revenue stream we have from oil and gas, quite frankly, and it's probably up now because of the performance of the stock market, is the permanent fund. But that's going to be challenged in the future also from that standpoint. robbing Peter to pay Paul and think we can do it and get by and let somebody else come in and worry about the future. Now's the time that we need to be laying long-term plans and not instant gratification from those revenues. But I don't see the leadership at this point in time, whether it's executive or legislative bodies, entertaining those thoughts. Now, maybe after the November election, there might be a new boldness out there until another election comes along in 2 years. But this state cries for a revenue stream that is going to supplant all the generosity of what oil and gas has delivered to us over the years on that. But inevitably, we wait until the 11th hour before we make that change. So appreciate the presentation, and God, I hope you're right, because if you're not right, you're going to get condemned. But we appreciate the effort, and once again, God doesn't like a coward, but he doesn't appreciate a fool either, from that standpoint. Let's move on to the next presentation. Transfer of $750 million stimulus funds to general fund. Okay. Secretary
Hello,
Romero
Mr. Chair.
and Charles Salee. Okay. Who's scheduled to?
So, Mr. Chair, the Acting Secretary Romero, I am sharing my screen, and I always have difficulties, so I've asked LFC if they can help me if you are having problems viewing the document. I kind of laugh because LFC consultant Linda Kehoe is a really good friend of mine, and we talk about our technical challenges, and so hopefully somebody can step in if you can't see the screen.
Well, the technical challenges have been throughout and on that, and I guess they're trying to get us up on YouTube or whatever it is from that standpoint, and I was encouraged to make that announcement, but if they couldn't hear what we were talking about, it was for naught on that. So we will live with that, and hopefully we'll be able to limp along until the new session comes into play, and hopefully that new session won't be postponed too long. It might help trying to forecast what the revenues will be for the next fiscal year. But the bottom line is the situation we're in as a nation and as a state, it certainly puts us in a very clumsy position. So with that, Charles, if you'll go ahead, or Debbie.
Okay. So, Mr. Chair, I'm hoping you can see my presentation.
We've got it in front of us, I think.
So, the very first thing that I want to show on slide 1, this is what the allocations have been for the CARES Act funding to date. You know, as we all know, we got $1.25 billion that was directed towards New Mexico. Of that, $188 million was distributed directly to Albuquerque and Bernalillo County. And so that left a balance of $1.067 million. We've made some disbursements. Department of Health got $65 million. DHSEM, 900,000. DUIT got $11 million. That was for contact tracing. DFA, we have $1 million to help with administrative costs associated with the CARES Act funding. Secretary of State, $6 million for the election. House Bill 1, $750 million that I know you're most interested in. And then the distribution to local and tribal governments of $178 million, leaving about $55 million that we are hoping to reimburse the state for expenses in FY20. And so we're pretty close to finalizing that. And so I'll have a better number for you on what we actually are able to charge against the FY20 expenses, hopefully next time we talk. So for the local government grants, there were 83 applications totaling $191 million. We actually allocated $99 million of that to local governments. There were 66 small business grants to local governments. and we awarded 49, almost $50 million into small business grants. Tribal grant applications, we received 21, totaling $38.2 million. So I think I just want to stop here a little bit and talk about the process that was used to award the money. DFA scored applications based on a criteria, and the criteria that was included had to do with COVID-related expenses. We know that the total amounts requested exceeded the funds available, so we had to prorate based on the need as articulated by the entity's applications. And so staff reviewed applications and scored them based on the responses that the communities provided in the applications. Need to point out that everybody got something. There was a cap of $50,000, or they got what they requested. And so I'm really happy to say that everybody got something. So on the next slide, just the status of where we are in the process as far as the grant agreements are concerned. 170 grant agreements were sent out, and of those, 160 have been returned. 20 of the 21 for tribes, and again, local government 7983, small business 61 of 66 agreements have been executed. So far, we've received reimbursements. As of last Friday, we had received reimbursements requests totaling 431. I expect that number is different this week because local governments are submitting their reimbursement requests. Some of the uses that we've seen, Lovington submitted reimbursement requests for sanitation, for GoToMeeting subscriptions. Summit Park is using their allocation for health and safety payroll, for PPE, for telework, and then Nambe Pueblo submitted requests for reimbursement for laptops and tablets for distant learning and for Head Start school children. The next slide, Mr. Chair, look, these are eligible expenses, and I've got to say that, you know, the guidance that we've gotten from the federal government, it's ever changing. From one week to the next, we might have we have a path. We're moving forward on a path based on the guidance, and then all of a sudden it kind of we get some more guidance that kind of changes that, and so we have to reevaluate. I can tell you that we know that eligible items are things for, you know, the payroll expenses for health and safety personnel. A couple of weeks ago, if they were more restrictive on how they were going to allow that money to be used. Last week, we got new guidance that said we're back to being more lenient in how we can account for those monies. So that helps the state and our health and safety positions, and it also helps the local governments. So there's a list of eligible items, things that we've had reimbursement requests that have been submitted that have been really hard to determine because the guidance is not so clear. You know, guidance allows for temporary shelters for restaurants, but it doesn't talk about, it allows you to pay for construction expenses associated with those temporary shelters, but not so much about permanent structures. And we've had requests from some communities to build permanent facilities for housing or to store food. They've asked for heavy equipment for roads and water lines, for shade structures in parks, and then for small business, loss of revenues and loss of inventory. Those things are a little bit less clear to us. And our concern is if we allow these, we may eventually end up having to repay the federal government. So right now, all these items are under legal review. We're trying to have our attorneys take a look at it, compare it to the guidance, and do some research to find out what other states are doing so that we can know whether or not we can move forward with allowing those type of expenses. And again, small business requests have included payroll support and permanent structures for outside dining. So I think the biggest, I've got to point out, so the $750 million that was set out in House Bill 1, there were, I think there were some ideas about how that money could be allocated, and you know, again, we talk about the guidance and how unclear it is, and how you know, we just really don't know in a lot of cases what we can use it for. We actually have been working with our DFA staff have been working with LFC staff. We really appreciate partnership, their assistance. They've come in and they've helped. You know, we've been able to explain what the struggles are from our point of view, not only just allocating the expenses, but, you know, some of the accounting issues and some of the other things. And so they've been really helpful in being able to go out there and look for what other states are doing and providing some ideas to the state on how, or to DFA on how they think the money can be used. So what I'm showing you on this slide again are some of the things that we think that we can use the $750 million for. My goal is to spend every single penny of that $750 million. The challenge is whether or not these things are going to be eligible, considered eligible, deemed eligible by the feds, and whether we can do it by December 30th, because that's the current deadline. Again, we had some, I mentioned earlier that there's been some chatter about a new proposal. I didn't see in the new proposal where they were talking about allowing this particular pot of money to be used to backfill revenue, or any discussions about extending the date past December 30th. I think what I saw was a new proposal for additional money, and so this is still kind of iffy right now. The problem is we can't wait. So I talked about the accounting issues. So everything that's going to be funneled to agencies through their budgets, we've got to account for that separately. So we've got to, even though it's going through the general fund, it's being deposited in the general fund, and it's going to flow out as a general fund. If we're going to be able to account for it, as far as the feds are concerned, there's a whole bunch of accounting steps and issues that we're having to deal with right now. So we're working really closely with the two biggest agencies and some of the larger state agencies that we think we're going to be able to capture the money from, or the expenses. That's the higher education institutions and public schools. And so this is the proposed kind of draft spending plan that DFA and LFC have come up with so far. And so you can see it exceeds the $750 million, which is, you know, gives us a little bit of wiggle room, but still there's some questions about whether or not all of these things are going to be eligible. You know, we really can't wait to see what the feds are going to do, you know, what kind of guidance we're going to get. So, you know, I know that auditors are waiting for Office of Management and Budget to come out with the supplement for auditing purposes. And so auditors are really struggling right now trying to figure out exactly what they're going to test these expenditures against. And they can't really do it until they get that compliance supplement. But the state of New Mexico, we can't wait, because the clock is ticking. We're running up against that December deadline. And so we've got to move forward and just trying to find all the expenses. And we're trying to be as creative as we can. And while knowing that there's still lots of questions. So these are the buckets that have been identified. You know, public health and safety is pretty easy bucket. Now that they've given us so much more leniency on how we need to account for this money. And so on the spending plan that I just changed from, you could see the agencies that we're talking about. We believe that in bucket number 2 was the education. We think that, you know, 160 million of that is going to be for technology and PPE. About 6 million of it for higher education. So the first one is K-12, and the second one is higher education. You know, recent guidance that had come out said that we can allow $500 per student for distant learning, PPE, and other costs to comply with CDC. So that gave us a little bit of flexibility. And now we don't have to actually have, you know, we can guess based on the number of students, a $500 per student fee, how much we can charge against the CRF money. So that's good. what DFA and LFC have done is they're estimating that we can do the same thing for higher education, but that amount is $50, and I need to make sure that make it clear that that's not in the guidance. That's an assumption that we are making based on what they've allowed for K-12. So the next slide has 305 million. So this is another assumption that we're making. Staff is saying that 51% of the K-12 teacher and instructional assistants payroll can be charged to this. Federal government has been really clear in saying that instructional online time is not an eligible expense. But they have said that facilitating distance learning is, and we know that some of the larger school districts are having to spend a lot of time. They're estimating about 60% of the time to facilitate distance learning, and so that's where we came up with this assumption, and we're going to charge this against the CRF. Again, this is a questionable one. We don't have clear guidance on it, so we're hoping for the best. The last bucket 3 is everything else, and that's mostly state agency general fund expenditures, telework expenses, medical expenses, PPE, housing support, food, and testing. So this is, I think, what you're most interested in is the actual transfer of the status. So part of the reason that the transfer hasn't taken place is that we were trying to close out FY20. We're done. We're there. Again, I mentioned that we will know exactly how much we're going to be using of the federal funds to reimburse the state for FY20. So now we're ready to start dealing with FY21. I think that we did file a report September 21st. That was required. We had $92 million worth of expenditures. We have another report due October 13th. And so staff is working on compiling all that information, getting all the expenditures from state agencies, higher education institutions, and public schools. There's still a lot of uncertainty about allowing the funds to be used for backfill. And we just don't know about the extension of time, but we can't afford to wait again because December 30th is coming up. We don't have a lot of time to spend this money. We've got to get it transferred. We're going to be charging as much of the expenses as we can. So we'll be transferring these in 1/6 increments. I had proposed 1/12, but that's, we were hoping that there was going to be an extension of the time, but I think because we know December is coming up, it's going to be done in 1/6 increments. So the first transfer will be about $325 million, and that'll be for the months July, August, and September. And I just can't stress enough that, the risk is that we may have to repay some of these funds if the federal government doesn't, deems them ineligible. So we're doing the best we can, hoping for the best, trying to be as creative as we can, and making sure that we use all of the $750 million. And so I think, and I want to thank LFC again for helping us through this process. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Girls.
This is where, say we could only. The government didn't allow that.
we've come up with consensus numbers in terms of what we think the state will be able to account for. And she went through some of those. The federal government all summer up until, I think there was another updated FAQ just a couple of days ago, are constantly shifting their guidance on the use of these funds. And so that's contributed to hesitancy on the part of the executive, as well as on the part of their auditors, who are going to actually have to go out and audit this funding next year. So some of the good changes have been the federal government's recognized the need that for public health and public safety employees that the state can simply charge all of its payroll expenses. Just assume that they're engaged with the public health emergency. So that's as much as going into the corrections department budget and looking at their 200 category and how much they're spending on those staff, public safety department, some of the public health department, even aging, school nurses. Schools can also qualify for that. And then as Secretary Romero talked about, we've been looking at other states and how they've been dealing with distance learning. This is an area where the federal government made a change that made this more difficult. So they had broadly defined facilitating distance learning as online learning, and basically had written the guidance, from my interpretation, was that if you are already engaged in online learning, that didn't qualify as a new expense. But if you're doing something different than how you were educating kids and students before, then that would be an eligible expense. Now the FAQ is more explicit that online learning alone is not necessary to comply with the public health order. Well, as staff, we don't agree with that interpretation or that position of Treasury. The Treasury did say that in order to facilitate distance learning, those costs would count. And if you have kids or grandkids and are observing what's going on right now with online learning and even the hybrid learning that's going to be in place for the coming months, there is not a lot of direct instruction going on. There is a lot of facilitating through the barriers that technology is causing between students and their teachers. And in fact, that really lines up with the use of instructional time for even in-person teaching, where we've done studies in the past finding that upwards of 60% of the time that's allocated for instruction is used for direct instruction. And so there's a lot of lost learning time even for in-person learning, and that's being exacerbated with the online learning situation. So we looked at school districts and how they were implementing these programs, what the state requirements were, and estimated that upwards of 60% of teachers would be facilitating distance learning through these different educational modalities. And so we agreed with DFA to take a more conservative approach of about 51% of their time, and thus salary cost could be charged for facilitating distance education. So that brings our total to 779. You saw Secretary Romero had another 20 million. They think they might be able to identify in agencies-based spending amounts. Both of those targets are above the necessary 750, so there's a little bit of cushion in there if we get other FAQs coming out saying we can't explicitly do things. Like she said, one of the good changes to the FAQ is the federal government recognized it was going to be an accounting nightmare to try to have every school district look at all of their PPE expenses and the filters you've been hearing about, the mask purchases. And so they just gave, and Chromebooks, they just gave states and school districts, for an accounting purposes standpoint, said $500 per student can be counted for all of those things. You don't have to show us the invoice and the voucher for that Chromebook that went to a certain elementary school. We believe the same could apply to higher education and applied a much smaller amount to that. Higher ed institutions are already starting to provide DFA estimates for the cost of PPE, testing, other mask wearing, and they're coming in higher than what the $50 per student cost will be. So I think they will be able to help out with that. Outside of the $750 million, there's about $140 million the executive set aside for other public health emergency spending. Of that amount, DFA's transferred $77 million to different agencies. $65 million to the Department of Health, $11 million to Department of Information Technology, and a little less than $900,000 to Homeland Security. We're noticing the spending of those dollars is starting to ramp up. It was a little bit low, and I think that gets to what Secretary Romero was talking about, trying to get FY20 cleaned up and being able to charge those funds. There's another $63 million that remains unbudgeted right now, but it's our understanding that DFA plans to make a transfer to the Secretary of State for election-related cost of $6 million, and much of the remaining cost can be charged to FY20 payroll cost for public health and safety staff. That will result in very large reversions from those agencies to the general fund. So that's something that will help reserves overall. The final part of the three-tiered strategy was that if, after all of the spending and accounting for it, the Fed said, no, you did it wrong, then DFA would need to go to the Board of Finance and certify that we need to draw from reserves in order to repay the federal government. So that's one argument for keeping in mind, we won't know this until after the fiscal year is complete and the auditors actually go in to find non-compliance. So you probably want to keep that risk that Secretary Romero talked about in the back of your mind as you're setting your reserve targets. Not to spend down reserves too much on the risk that you might need to pay some of this back. If her concerns turn out valid, that $300 million in school spending needs to be returned to the federal government, then that should weigh in your reserve target amounts. The HEROES version 2.0 that the House Speaker has proposed would allow this money, it's buried in a really large bill, but it would allow this pot of money to be used for backfilling if that comes to fruition, along with another round of stimulus payments to state and local governments. The final big piece of this overall CARES money, as Secretary Romero talked about, was allocated to local governments, small businesses that would be administered by local governments, and tribal entities. I'd like to turn your attention to some of the charts on page 1. Treasury, the FAQ was pretty clear that states should allocate money from the state to local governments on a per capita basis because that's how the federal government allocated it to states and cities and large counties. But DFA and the executive chose to do a percentage of what the overall request was. That did a couple of things. If you had an outsized request, you got an outsized award, even though they tried to make it fair and even across the board with reducing that. But it results in some distortions when you look at it. So, for example, Ruidoso received about $500,000 per 1,000 people, compared to $112,000 per 1,000 people in Gallup. Santa Fe received $46,000 per COVID case compared to $2,000 per COVID case in Gallup. Now, the allocation based on a per COVID basis was not part of the Treasury guidance, but in terms of analysis of you had set aside extra money for a couple of counties that at the time were being dealt with the COVID public health crisis at a much higher level than the rest of the state. We know that's shifted now, but that's where there was a hot spot that you would expect higher cost. That's not how the money ended up getting allocated out. With that, Mr. Chairman, we'd be happy to stand for any questions.
Representative Lundstrom.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank the LFC staff for the work that they've helped me to understand here, starting on page 1, as Charles mentioned there, on these additional charts. In other words, a different way to look at some of this. When we see the CARES Act grant award per COVID case, I'm looking at some of the areas of the state, obviously Gallup, Farmington, San Juan County, McKinley County, and Cibola County. And if I'm reading this correctly, we'll look right at Gallup on this chart. The value per COVID case is about $15. Is that right?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Lundstrom, it's about $2,000.
$2,000? Okay. Well, I'm trying to get a straight line across here, and obviously, we all know that in Gallup, McKinley County, San Juan County, Farmington, and Cibola were the hot spots, and now you see growth down in the Doña County area and along the border, excuse me, Mr. Chairman. And you see the low value awarded to these cases. At one point, McKinley County was considered number 5 in the entire country per capita in COVID cases, which is outrageous. And then, Mr. Chairman, I'm looking at the very last page when we're looking at these emergency grants to tribes. I have no idea how this was allocated, but I see that Navajo Nation was given 1.7 million, which is the same as the smallest pueblos throughout the state. I don't know how that gets determined when you think about land mass, population, number of cases, and everything. Does anyone know how this was distributed, Debbie or someone?
So, Mr. Chair, for the tribal allocations, every tribal government received $2 million. It was just the straight distribution to all tribal governments. We had $28 million earmarked for them, and so that was it was based on that. I can tell you right now, Madam Chair, Mr. Chair, Madam Chair, that as of right now, Navajo Nation is the only tribe that has not submitted their grant agreement back. They're the one outlier out there, so they haven't even requested the $2 million. So, I mean, there's a potential that we can reallocate some of this money if some of these communities, tribal governments, don't submit their grant agreements or aren't interested in receiving some of these funds.
So, Debbie, that leads me, thank you for the next question, Mr. Chairman. So we've talked about a deadline of December 2020. So it's my understanding, and we've discussed this before, that for those allocations that were made, if it's not spent by December 2020, it reverts back, and that it's based on a reimbursable. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, Representative Lundstrom, that's correct.
And then I wanted to ask again, because we talked about this, I believe it was in Cloudcroft, about the $750 million that we had asked that be moved to the appropriation fund. It still hasn't happened. At that point, I wrote down specifically, because I keep my notes in this notebook, that you had said we were going to see that the month of July transfer, July and August, was going to be transferred. 1/12 was going to be moved, and that still hasn't happened. I guess I'm just not clear if a month or so ago we said we're going to do this and we haven't. What's really changed, or what is preventing us from doing this?
So, Mr. Chair, Representative Lundstrom, I appreciate the question, and I had every intention of having that transferred done in July. Again, we were struggling with trying to close out FY20, and a lot of it has to do with the accounting that we're having to do in capturing all the COVID expenses. That took a little bit longer than we expected. I wasn't comfortable because we really didn't have a plan in place on how we were going to capture the expenses in agencies' budgets. And so we're in a much better position now. We have a better idea of what we can capture. And so now I think it's more appropriate for us to go ahead and do that transfer. Today is the 30th. I was expecting to try to get that done today, actually, after I get done with this hearing. We'll be working with staff to get that done. So again, originally it was going to be in 1/12 increments. Now, because we're going to shoot and say that December is our deadline, so we're going to do it in 1/6 increments, and so we're going to be transferring $325 million today.
Well, thank you, Debbie. I look forward to that, and I think that helps relieve some heartburn that I have, and maybe some of the other committee members have. I appreciate that would be done. I do again want to express my concern about this local government distribution. It's my understanding that there was a lot of confusion in what the criteria would be. But at the end of the day, regardless of who it is here, if they can't provide receipts and show that they spent the money, it reverts. So I appreciate that, and I want to thank the staff for working up this additional point of view. I did ask for it, and I think it's important information. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Kernan.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question on the proposed spending plan, the $305 million for 6 months of 51% instructional payroll. So how will that money be distributed to districts, or does it just go in the big pot? Tell me how that's distributed.
Mr. Chair, Senator Kernan, what we've discussed with DFA and PED is you appropriated a certain amount of general fund for the state equalization guarantee. This 750 would be part of that. And basically the schools would just need a new accounting code. That would be like CARES SEG to be able to show what portion of their total SEG is coming from this federal money. And then we've worked with, again, DFA and PED to create a new object of expense code on the spending side of the ledger, for teachers facilitate distance learning. And then the guidance would come from DFA and PED to districts on how to charge their 51% of their payroll cost in the instruction budget to that object code. And that's really just needed for them to show their auditors when they come in. It's not going to, we don't feel it's going to create a huge accounting burden on the districts, and we thought this was a good approach to meet the needs of what the auditors are going to have to do next year, but not overwhelm school districts with creating an entirely new separate fund with a lot of confusion around what their SEG is going to be.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so does that money also have to be accounted for within that certain time period, or it reverts?
Yes, and so districts will be sending in their first quarter actuals to PED pretty soon, so we'll be able to look and see what those payroll costs are and how they line up. And then we'll make an assumption that those would continue because they're usually pretty stable semester to semester, that those expenses would be the same for the next quarter to be able to be fully expensed by the end of the calendar year. And again, they just need to show it in their books by the time that their auditors come around the following year. So.
Okay, so Mr. Chairman, just one last question on that. So school districts that remain online, typically they're going to be reported in that manner, therefore they're going to receive more funding. As districts desire to go back and are allowed to go back, that's going to decrease that percentage that they're going to receive. Is that correct?
Mr. Chair, Senator, right now the public health order is going to require a hybrid in-person at best. And so I don't see us returning to a normal in-person learning year. And so we would make these assumptions for the first half of the year and not create a new burden on the districts if they choose a different learning model than fully online.
Okay, thank you very much. And one last question on the distribution of CARES Act money to the communities. And I guess this might be for the Secretary. So you mentioned the application process, and tell me again what you said the criteria was on that application process.
So, Mr. Chair, the criteria related to the COVID-related expenses, so things like whether the community was, and the public health order, whether the community was open or whether they shut down. Talked about, there were questions about revenue loss. There were questions about enforcement, public health and safety expenses. So that's the criteria that was included in the applications, and the responses were scored based on what the local community submitted. And so again, this is very technical staff that has done these type of scoring processes in the past for other programs, and so they are familiar with how to rate and rank projects, and I use the same staff that have had the experience so that we would have a better technical review of the applications.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you. I looked at the application that my community filled out, and I guess I was a little surprised with the number of questions related to how well they responded to the requirements for being a safe community. And I found it was really weighted more in that direction, maybe than on the expenses that they had. So that concerned me initially. My community seemed to be satisfied with what they received, so I'm really not issuing a complaint. But I did find the questions on the application very interesting, and I think every member should take a look at those. Thank you.
Representative Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Madam Secretary, I have concerns on how this money was divided between all these counties. Let's go on the emergency grant for tribal people. We have here, and I represent both of these. One is Isleta Pueblo, and one is Laguna Pueblo. They got 600,000, and then you go up to the first one, Picarillas, I guess, got 2 million. How did they divide this money? And I hate to keep on kicking the can down the road, but it doesn't make sense how this money is being divided.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm going to have to look into that because my understanding was that all tribal governments got the same amount. If there were a couple that got a little bit lesser amount, it could have been because their request was not the 2 million. Most of the requests came in higher than they came in higher than $2 million, and so we kind of set the cap at $2 million. But if they requested less than the $2 million, they probably got what they requested.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Secretary, and these are actually requests that these people did, because like Laguna and Acoma, they're still shut down right now. You know, they're still on quarantine, and we can't go in, they can't come out. So are these actual request numbers?
Mr. Chair, I believe that they are, and I can verify that and let you know.
Could you check on that and verify for me? Because, you know, these numbers are not just not matching.
Are you on?
Mr. Chair,
Romero?
Madam Secretary, and another thing, on the money you guys allowed per case, you know, Representative Armstrong already touched on that one, but, you know, Cibola County got, I think, like 15, and Rio Doso got 150. How do you justify for these numbers being so far off from each other?
I'm sorry, Mr. Chair, I muted myself. So applicants submitted their request and they provided an amount of what they wanted to be reimbursed. And so basically, so if there was a community, we had communities that you know, that requested large sums, and we had other communities, Gallup is a perfect example, that we know had a big impact, but their request was not that high. And so we as DFA, when I say we, DFA, the technical staff, we had to go based on what was submitted in the application. And so we can't make assumptions for those local governments. They know what their expenses are. They know what the impact has been to their communities. And so we left that decision to them on how much they should be, how much they wanted to apply for. And so I think a lot of it had to do with very first thing is what did they apply for? Second thing is how did they respond to the questions included in the application, because that's what they were scored on. And so based on that you know, we had a high to low based on the scores, and then because we knew that they had the requests outnumbered what we actually had available, we had to prorate the distributions. And so I think that that's what you're seeing in some cases, is the fact that some didn't apply for as much, and then secondly, they may not have scored as well, and so that may have left them in a lower tier than maybe somebody else. And so that was the rationale behind the scoring process.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Secretary, maybe we're on the wrong page here, because what I'm looking at is the CARES Act per COVID case. And I'm wondering how did Rio Doso come up with over 140 per case, and Cibola County came out with 15? That's what the question is.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, I don't have that document, and so I don't know what I think that's a document that was prepared by LFC, and so I can't respond to that, I'm sorry.
Mr. Chairman, Madam Secretary, that's fine, but you would think, you presented this today, you would think you'd have the paperwork to answer a question. Now, I don't know where we're at on this. Now we'll have to wait on that. Thank you for that.
Senator Munoz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Debbie, I want to ask you some questions on your presentation. So when are we going to have firm guidelines for the cities and the counties to follow, so we're not getting close to the date and saying, oh, well, it changed again? So do we know who's going to set the guidelines? Are you guys going to determine them by federal standards? What's the requirements, and what is the hard date that they're going to have and say, these are the requirements you're going to have, and this is the time frame?
So, Mr. Chair, Senator Munoz, thank you for the question. So I think, earlier in the presentation, I talked about how we're pretty confident with the majority of the requests that are coming in. There are some that we just don't know because the federal guidelines are not clear. And because the federal guidelines aren't clear, just like the expenses that we're trying to charge against the $750 million, we're making some assumptions. And so we want to be as close to have as much guidance as we can as soon as possible. So I'm hoping that by the end of this week, we will have those outliers. There's about a handful of outliers, like things for construction, for purchasing of heavy equipment, and those things. I'm hoping to have a decision from our legal by the end of the week so that we can provide those to local governments. This has been a hard process because, as Mr. Salih pointed out, and I think I pointed out a couple of times, the guidance has been constantly changing, or it's just really not clear in certain areas, and then you just have to make assumptions. We reach out to national organizations to see what other states are doing a lot of times, just to see if we are in line with, and if we have some support for what we're doing. We know we've got to get this money spent as quickly as possible. So my goal is to have those legal analysis done by the end of the week so that those communities will know that they can spend the money.
And Mr. Chairman, Debbie, that's the number one question is if we give them guidelines and tell them how they can spend the money, and the feds come back and say, oh, that one didn't qualify, then they've spent the money, then they got to dig it out of their budget. So, how are we going to equalize that protection back? Are we holding some funds back in case the feds come back and say this didn't qualify, and so we can hold those counties harmless because we advised them that they could qualify?
So, Mr. Chair, I think we have made the assumption that the state's on the hook for the money, not necessarily the local governments, because we are the grantee. We are the one that receive the money. So it's up to us to make sure that those funds have been used for eligible expenses. I think there was a little bit of discussion about, is the local government on the hook? I don't think we are going to force that issue, honestly. I think it'll fall back on the state.
So, Mr. Chairman and Debbie, I guess so we can better pay close attention to the cities and the counties and better go ahead and spend it, and no matter how you guys classify it, the state is on the hook. So if you set guidelines, and I believe this was said earlier, is we're going to follow the federal guidelines, then, so I informed my county, said, well, you can use March through December for your police. And so the county did that, and then they tell me the other day that the DFA is saying that's not eligible now, that you can only use a time frame for COVID expenses. So I told them one thing, and you told me that thing, and I told them, and now we're getting a different message on public safety.
So, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, I didn't, that shouldn't be happening because public safety, public health, that's the no-brainer. That's the one thing we are pretty clear on, that money can be used for those purposes. They don't have to provide a lot of documentation to show that, it's just assumed. And so it sounds like that's a message that I need to pass on to staff that are reviewing all of these requests, and I'm happy to do that.
Yeah, I mean, we just got to make it clear cut to everybody so they don't keep chasing their tail with what DFA is coming out with and what guidelines they're following. The other thing I wanted to ask you, and I don't know if it was an oversight or what happened, but I do not see Zuni on the list of tribal governments that received anything. Did they not apply? What happened with Zuni? I thought we tried to treat everybody equal. And it was on Charles's presentation with all the tribes and
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator, this is the list that we received from DFA, so I'll defer to Secretary Romero on if that's changed and your question about Zuni.
Mr. Chair, I believe that Zuni did not apply. I think they're the only tribal government that did not apply.
So, Mr. Chairman and Madam Secretary, so with the balances left over, can Zuni still apply? I guess it'd be just to treat them fairly.
Mr. Chair, I'm welcome. I'm happy to speak to Zuni to find out what their needs are. We want to make sure that we spend as much of this money as we possibly can. If we have any flexibility, I'm happy to entertain that.
Mr. Chairman and Debbie, so on the tribal governments, are they under the same requirements as the city and counties for their reimbursements?
Mr. Chair, Senator Munoz, yes. We have to follow have to make sure that they are COVID-related expenses.
And Mr. Chairman, my final question, and it goes back to the school districts on your presentation, Mrs. Romero. I just want to make sure that you know the $305 million and it's $500 per additional kid. But didn't the school districts receive their own CARES funding on top of this? And so, man, that's going to be a lot of money out there. Because I mean, and I know people need it, but you know, I will use myself as example. The little EBT cards or debit cards that you guys sent to every student last year that graduated for food. You know, my kid received one, and really shouldn't have received one. He was graduating, but he did. But I know that it's helping certain families, but how are those working out? Because, you know, there may be families that receive $2,000 if they have 4 kids per household for food, and then plus the school is supplying breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and now weekend meals. And so how are we all accounting for that in CARES Act, and how much did each school district is actually going to get in CARES money, and how much per student? Because some of this money should be used for our SEG, for other critical needs, and not just tack another 500 and put it in a pile where the school districts will add another assistant superintendent or get heavy on upper administration while the teachers in them are in the classroom. So, go ahead, Charles.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, I want to be very clear for the committee and your listeners. The $305 million and the $160 million are not on top of anything else. It's just that portion of SEG that you've already appropriated is going to have to be charged to different object codes to meet the federal requirements. So it's no extra money. It's the SEG, and a part of the SEG is going to be federal funds that they have to show in their books. And the federal government has told us, we'll make it easy for you. We'll assume that schools, out of whatever you give them, are going to spend about $500 on PPE, Chromebooks, other kinds of things, without the district having to show their auditors that they actually purchased it for that. And so I just want to be abundantly clear, there's no extra money as a result of this accounting exercise. It's simply a after-the-fact accounting exercise that needs to go on to demonstrate to the federal government how we use that money.
And Mr. Chairman Charles, so when they did the CARES Act funding for the school districts, and I know my school district bought every kid a computer, so they said, so they used that money, and then they're going to get an additional 500 on top of that for the PPP. And we don't have to account for this additional $500 per student in the CARES Act in any way, shape, or form. It's going to go straight into the SEG, correct?
Mr. Chair, Senator, the amount of money we're talking about today is just going to go straight into the SEG. You don't have to show an invoice, or a voucher for what you spent on that $500. It's just going to be a straight up, it's going to count. So they don't even need to do anything on the other end of their books for that money. They'll have to show it as a revenue code. Now, schools and higher ed, you're correct. Just like agencies, the CARES Act appropriated a whole ton of federal grant money outside of this pot of state and local relief that school districts will have to specifically account for how they spent that money. And that's going to be in a separate fund outside of the state equalization guarantee. So there will be, a separate account that PED's already set up. It will have a very detailed charting of accounts, that school districts will have to show exactly how they spent that money.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman Charles. So this, for the additional 5, it's just going to go in the SEG, so there'll be no accounting, but the CARES Act money that was sent prior will be additional accounting in line items.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct.
And so, Mr. Chairman Charles, since we're on that, so how does higher ed account for that? Because it says for technology and PPP for higher ed, and $6 million, I don't know what it breaks down, $50 per student, which is not much. So how did they have to account for it the same way, or how are we adding that into their accounting formula?
Mr. Chairman, Senator, for right now, that's an estimate. So higher ed, the federal government hasn't given us as clear of guidance for higher ed expenses for PPE and those other types of spending as they did for K-12 public schools. But we're making an assumption if they had, and it was a really low amount, like you said, only $50, how much do we think that they could account? And so the higher ed institutions right now are going through that accounting exercise where they're coming back. I think one the other day said we could only find $7 million at one institution where they spent money on PPE, masks, and other kinds of things. So they're already ahead of our estimates. They will need to specifically account for that in their books and with their auditors.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Additional questions from committee members? Thank you very much. We're going to break until 1:15. The lunch can be served in the Senate lounge. Sandwiches in there. Have at it. Thank you.
Is this FTE? So that must be FTE. And the other one, Charles, is Mexico Military Institute. Simply it would be the only one that would have. Okay. Well, in the institute, they don't have it can really just because 80% enrollment.